The social hall of Sage Flats smelled like pine resin tallow candles in the particular desperation of a town that had run out of other options. Nora Elspeth Vane stood in line number 7, last position, last hope, and told herself she was not going to cry. She had not cried in 4 years, not when her father died between one printing press cycle and the next, ink still on his hands. Not when the Pittsburgh boarding house turned her out after she missed 2 weeks of rent caring for her mother. Not even on the train west, watching Pennsylvania dissolve into something flatter and more indifferent when she'd understood for the first time that she had no plan beyond arriving. She was not going to cry in a place like this. The Sage Flats Choosing Night had been held annually for 22 years, according to the broadsheet she'd read on the stage from Billings. The broadsheet used words like community tradition and practical partnership opportunity and mutually beneficial social arrangement. What it meant translated into plain English was this: 12 men who needed wives and 15 women who needed wages would stand in a public hall while 300 of their neighbors watched and judged, and at the end of it, however many were left unpaired, would ride home alone. Simple arithmetic said 3 women would leave alone tonight. Nora had known boarding the stage that she would be one of them. She was not pretty in the way that mattered on a frontier. She was not tall or broad-shouldered, not built for the kind of labor that kept a ranch alive through winter. She had her father's coloring dark auburn hair that frizzed in dry mountain air, eyes, an indeterminate shade between green and gray that her mother had diplomatically called interesting. She was 26 years old, which was not ancient, but was not young by the standards of a territory where girls married at 17. She had no land, no livestock, no family connections west of the Mississippi, and no dowry beyond a worn leather case containing a change of dress, her mother's silver thimble, and a 3-year-old ledger from her father's print shop that she carried because the handwriting in it was his and she couldn't bear to leave it behind. What she had, she could keep books. She could calculate supply costs, cross-reference vendor invoices, and identify a discrepancy in a profit and loss column at 30 paces. She had done it for her father's shop, for 2 other businesses in Pittsburgh's printing district, and for Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house in exchange for reduced rent. She was the best accountant who had never been paid a professional wage for the work because professional wages went to men. She had come to Montana Territory because her mother was dying and medicine required money and Sage Flats was hiring. The line of women shifted. Up ahead, the first choosing was already complete. Harriet Nolan, whose father owned 300 head of cattle and a hay operation, had been selected by the Morrison boy within 30 seconds of the process beginning. The crowd had applauded. Harriet had blushed on cue. Nora watched without expression. The hall was larger than she'd expected, and for a town this size, planked floors. Recently swept oil lamps hung at intervals that cast the kind of warm, flattering light that made everyone look like a daguerreotype of themselves. The 12 bachelors stood in a loose cluster to the left, farmers and ranchers and tradesmen, ranging from 19 to 50, dressed in their best with varying degrees of success. The 15 women stood in their numbered positions along the right wall, some clutching flowers, some holding family documents that proved their worth in land and livestock. Nora held nothing. Her hands were at her sides. Mayor Gerald Hutchins, resplendent in a black coat that strained at the buttons, presided from a raised platform at the front of the hall. He had the practiced joviality of a man who had done this many times and found it reliably entertaining. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "let the choosing commence." The first 6 rounds went smoothly. Not for Nora, she was not approached, but smoothly in the general sense of events proceeding as expected. Harriet Nolan went first, then Cecilia Marsh, then the Duval sisters, who'd come together from Bozeman. By the 5th pairing, the crowd had settled into a rhythm of anticipation and approval, and Nora had settled into the particular stillness she'd learned to inhabit when she needed to get through something difficult without showing the cost. She watched the bachelors, evaluated them the way she evaluated ledger columns, not for sentiment, but for pattern. Thomas Renner, the cattle buyer, soft hands, hard eyes, the way he looked at the women suggested he was pricing them. She was glad when he chose someone else. Martin Greer, widower. 3 sons he circled twice, asked questions she couldn't hear. From this distance, moved on. Nora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She did not want to be chosen by the wrong man. She was not sure, given her circumstances, that she had the luxury of that particular preference. At the 7th round, a young man named Samuel Whitfield approached her position. He was perhaps 24, with an earnest face and the kind of nervous energy that came from trying very hard to do the right thing. He stopped in front of Nora and studied her with visible discomfort. Miss Vane, yes, you're from Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh. He nodded slowly, working through something internal. You got family out here? No. Land back east, any sort of... No. He looked at his boots. I'm trying to build a stake. Put together enough to file a homestead claim by spring. A man needs a wife who brings something into the arrangement. Capital land, a working knowledge of... He stopped. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be unkind. You're not being unkind, Nora said. You're being practical. He looked almost grateful for the absolution. I'm sorry, he said again anyway, and moved down the line to choose a girl from Bozeman whose uncle ran a hardware supply. The second rejection came from a rancher named Hiram Fonsi, who was 60 if he was a day and smelled like he'd made peace with bathing sometime in the previous decade. He took one look at Nora and said, too educated. That kind causes trouble. He said it like a diagnosis, matter-of-factly, and walked away. Nora filed that one under narrow escape and kept her chin level. The third was worse. Albert Crew had apparently come to choosing night not to find a wife, but to find an audience. He stopped in front of Nora, looked her up and down slowly and deliberately, a performance for the men watching nearby, and shook his head with theatrical regret. No offense, miss, but a man in my position needs a woman who makes an impression when she walks into a room. Someone in the crowd laughed. Nora's face went hot. The fourth man didn't bother with an explanation. He simply shook his head. The fifth was a young homesteader named Delbert Hicks who smelled of sour mash and righteousness. He spent 2 minutes listing the qualities he required in a partner robust constitution, documented family history, prior experience with livestock, demonstrated domestic capacity, before concluding that Nora met none of them. He seemed pleased by his own thoroughness. The sixth was Charles Vaughn, who everyone apparently considered a reasonable catch. Mid-30s, a good section of land east of town, a decent reputation. He stopped in front of Nora and folded his hands behind his back like a man preparing to deliver an assessment. Miss Vane, you're the woman keeping books at the stage depot. I was, yes, for 3 weeks while they were between clerks. Word is you found an error in their quarterly accounts. A significant one, yes. And you told them about it. Of course. Vaughn nodded slowly. Here's my concern. I run a ranch. My first wife managed the household accounts, never questioning me about them, and things ran smooth. You strike me as the type who would question, who would find problems where I'd rather not have them found. He paused. That's not what I need. Nora looked at him steadily. Then you're right, she said. I'm not what you need. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps that she'd agreed so readily. He opened his mouth, closed it, and moved on. 6 down. The hall was quieter now. People had noticed the pattern. Whispers circulated like weather. Poor thing. 7 men, and she hasn't been chosen yet. Well, what did she expect? Look at her. Nora heard them with perfect clarity. She stood in her position and thought about her mother's last letter, folded in the pocket of her good dress, the navy wool, the one she'd pressed twice before leaving Pittsburgh. Whatever it takes, her mother had written. You've always found a way. I know you'll find one now. She was running out of men to find a way with. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat from the platform with the particular delicacy of a man who had presided over awkward situations before and knew better than to draw more attention to them. We have one remaining choice to be made this evening, he announced, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man walking a wire. Mr. Warren Bly. Warren Bly was young and wiry, with a farmer's hands and a farmer's direct gaze. He'd been watching the proceedings from the edge of the bachelor group with increasing unease. Now he approached the remaining unchosen women. There were 3 of them, Nora included, and stopped with evident calculation in front of the woman next to Nora. Ada Collins, a widow from Billings, who'd come with a small but real claim of 40 acres. Nora did not watch. She looked at the far wall, instead at a crack in the plaster that ran from the baseboard to the lamp bracket, and breathed carefully. This was the part she had prepared for, the walk home, the mathematics of what happened next. She had perhaps $12 remaining after the stage fare. The stage depot job was gone. They had hired a man last week at double what they'd paid Nora. There was talk of a position at the mining company's assay office, but that was 30 miles north and required a letter of recommendation she did not have. She would work it out. She had worked out worse. The sound of a chair scraping across planed wood cut through the murmur of the crowd. Loud, deliberate, the kind of sound that made 300 people go simultaneously quiet. Nora turned. In the back corner of the hall, a man she had not noticed all evening was rising from his chair. She had not noticed him because he had apparently been engineered not to be noticed, seated in the last row, hat pulled low, wearing the kind of plain dark coat that communicated nothing. He was tall, which became apparent as he stood well over 6 feet, lean, in the way of a man who worked rather than the way of a man who forgot to eat. His face as he moved into the lamplight was striking in the way of geography rather than conventional handsomeness, angular, weathered, with the particular quality of attention in his eyes that made Nora think irrelevantly of a surveyor studying ground he was about to purchase. He moved through the crowd without hurrying. People stepped back without being asked, not from fear exactly, from something more reflexive, the way animals cleared a path for whatever was most certain in the room. He stopped in front of Nora. She had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. They were amber. She noticed the color of creek water over pale stone, currently fixed on her with an expression of absolute and unmistakable assessment. "Miss Nora Vane." Not a question. "Yes," she said. "You kept books for Aldrich's stage depot." "For 3 weeks, yes. Before that, Connolly's dry goods and Billings." She felt the first unsteadiness of the evening. He had done research. "For 2 months while I was deciding whether to come farther west. And before that, 3 businesses in Pittsburgh, including a print shop under a man named Vane. My father's shop." Something in his expression acknowledged this without softening. "I'm Everett Cross. I own Iron Gate Ranch north of here. It's the largest holding in this part of the territory, 12,000 acres, 400 head of registered cattle, 2 barns, 12 full-time workers." He paused. "I need someone to manage the accounts. The books have been a disaster for 3 years, and I don't have time to fix them myself." The hall was utterly silent. Nora could feel 300 pairs of eyes on the back of her neck. "Mr. Cross," Mayor Hutchins said carefully from his platform, "the choosing is for—" "I know what the choosing is for," Everett said without looking at the mayor. "Make it official." The mayor blinked. "But you've never in all the years we've—" "Miss Vane." Everett turned back to her, ignoring the mayor entirely. "You agree to the arrangement or you don't. Your choice." The words struck her like a thrown stone. Your choice. Not a performance of being chosen. Not a transaction being conducted over her head. An actual question directed at her, requiring an actual answer. She heard someone in the crowd whisper, "She'll say no. She can't possibly accept. The man hasn't even courted her." And she felt something clarify inside her with the cold precision of a column finally balancing. She said yes. The hall erupted. She had expected noise relief confusion. Perhaps some residual hostility from the men who had rejected her, now watching the most eligible rancher in the territory choose the woman they dismissed. What she had not expected was the specific quality of the sound, which was less like celebration and more like a collective recalibration, as if the room had been operating under one set of assumptions about how the world worked and was now being required to update. Mayor Hutchins, visibly flustered, produced the paperwork. The registry was signed, witnesses attested. A notary seal, actual officials, stamped into heavy cream paper, was pressed over both their signatures. Loretta Shaw, the banker's daughter, who had been the hall's acknowledged beauty and had been chosen second to last by a rancher named Briggs with considerable, evident satisfaction, appeared at Nora's elbow. Everett Cross stepped away to exchange a word with the mayor. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice carrying the precise pitch of a woman who believes herself wronged. "I signed the document." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Loretta looked at Nora with eyes that were beautiful and currently calculating at high speed. "Everett Cross has refused every matchmaking attempt in this territory for 6 years. 6 years. My mother personally invited him to supper 4 times. He never came. And then you, after 7 rejections—" She stopped as if the mathematics refused to resolve properly in her mind. "I can't explain what I don't yet understand myself," Nora said. A woman she recognized as Mary Allgate, wife of the man who'd built the stage depot, touched her arm from the other side. "Be careful, dear." Her voice was not unkind. "Iron Gate has a history. Everett Cross isn't a cruel man, but he's not a warm one either. And his cousin—" She paused as if editing herself. "Just be careful." The wagon was outside when Nora collected her case from the cloakroom. Everett Cross sat in the driver's seat with the reins already gathered, his expression suggesting he had performed one social obligation for the evening and was done with all others. Nora climbed up beside him. He clicked to the horses without ceremony. They left Sage Flats in the dark. For 15 minutes, neither of them spoke. The road north ran through Sage Flats that justified the town's name, endless rolling gray-green under a sky full of stars, The kind of sky Pittsburgh had never managed even on its clearest nights. Nora sat with her case on her knees and her hands folded over the clasp and watched the darkness go by mine. Then you knew who I was before tonight, she said. You knew where I'd worked. Yes. You investigated me. I had inquiries made, yes. She absorbed this. How long ago? 3 weeks. When I heard you'd come to Sage Flats and were looking for work. 3 weeks. She'd been in Sage Flats for exactly 3 weeks and 4 days subsisting on depot wages and cornbread from the boarding house. You could have just offered me a job, she said. I could have. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved at a steady walk, their breath visible in the cold air. Because what I need at Iron Gate requires more than an employee. I need someone who has authority in the house. Authority over the books, over purchasing, over financial decisions. Wade, my cousin, has been managing those accounts for 3 years. He won't accept oversight from someone he can dismiss. She turned to look at him. In profile, the lamp on the wagon threw one side of his face into warm shadow. But he would accept it from a wife. He'd have to. She stopped. Calculated, he finished without apparent discomfort. Yes, I won't pretend otherwise. Nora looked back in the road. She was aware of a variety of feelings about this irritation, a specific species of pride she'd cultivated as a shield, and underneath both of those something more complicated that she didn't examine immediately. She had agreed to the arrangement with clear eyes. She had not expected sentiment. Sentiment was not what she was here for. What happened to your wife? She asked. Silence. I heard she died, Nora said carefully. 6 years ago. Typhoid. July of 1876. His voice carried no inflection at all, not grief or hardness or defensive neutrality. Just the flat factual delivery of a man who had arranged this particular piece of himself where it couldn't be accidentally touched. We'd been married 3 years. He stopped. She kept the books. She was good at it. Nora didn't say she was sorry. In her experience, people who had absorbed a loss deeply enough to speak of it in that careful, flat tone had heard sorry too many times for the word to carry weight. I'm not trying to replace her, she said instead. I'm not looking for a replacement. Then we understand each other. He glanced at her for the first time since they'd left town, a brief assessing look that reminded her of the moment in the hall when he'd crossed the room toward her. You're not frightened, he said. I'm very frightened, Nora said honestly. I'm just not letting it run things. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that a piece of information had arrived and was being properly filed. They rode the rest of the way in a more comfortable silence. Iron Gate Ranch appeared gradually the way significant things often did. First a fence line, then the suggestion of pasture, then buildings resolving out of darkness that Nora slowly understood were larger than she'd been imagining. The main house stood on a rise, stone and timber construction, 3 stories with a wide porch that ran the full front facade. Below it, barns and outbuildings and corrals spread out across what seemed like an improbable amount of space. It's large, she said uselessly. It's a working operation, he agreed, pulling the wagon up to the house. A woman was waiting on the porch. She was perhaps 58, with the posture of someone who had once been told to stand straight and decided it was the last piece of advice she'd ever take from anyone. She crossed her arms as Nora climbed down from the wagon. This is Harriet Drummond, Everett said. She manages the household. Harriet Drummond looked at Nora with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who had no time for people who required more than one explanation of anything. She looked at the single worn case, the carefully pressed navy dress, the face that was tired but steady. You're younger than I expected, she said finally. I'm 26, Nora said. And before tonight, you'd never set foot on a working ranch. No, I haven't. Do you ride? I can learn. Harriet made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You'd better. She turned and went back inside without further ceremony, clearly expecting Nora to follow. Everett had handed her case down from the wagon. Breakfast is at 5:30, he said. The office is on the ground floor east end of the house. The ledgers are on the desk. He paused. Get some sleep first. Mr. Cross, she turned back to him. He waited. Why me? She held up a hand before he could repeat the practical explanation. I understand the accounting rationale. I understand why a wife rather than an employee. But there were 15 women in that hall tonight. Some of them were better positioned than I am by every conventional measure. Why specifically me? The lamplight was steady on his face. He seemed to be considering whether to answer honestly or deflect. He answered honestly. 3 weeks ago, when my man in town first mentioned you, I looked into your work history. Not the jobs, what people said about how you worked. He paused. Aldrich at the stage depot said you found a discrepancy in the quarterly accounts that would have cost them $300 over the course of a year. He said when you told him about it, your first concern was whether it was an error or deliberate. You asked him that before you told him the number. Nora frowned. I didn't want to accuse anyone falsely. I know. That's why I noticed it. He picked up her case and handed it to her. That kind of care is what I need right now, not just a bookkeeper, someone who asks the right questions. She stood there with her case in both hands and felt the sentence land in the specific part of her that had been calculating what she was worth for the past 6 months. Good night, Mr. Cross, she said. Good night, Miss Vane. He paused. Nora. She went inside. Harriet Drummond showed her to a room on the second floor, east facing a single window, a bed with a heavy quilt, a washstand with a full pitcher. Plain and clean and more than Nora had expected. The water's cold, Harriet said. It's always cold. The stove in your room needs coaling twice a day. There are ranch hands in the bunkhouse north of here who are already talking about you, and whatever they say in the next week is mostly nonsense, so disregard it. Questions. Mrs. Drummond? Nora set her case on the bed. The cousin, Wade Cross, what should I know about him? Harriet went very still. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of someone deciding what to say, but the stillness of someone deciding how much to say and whether the risk of saying it outweighed the risk of saying nothing. He's been managing Iron Gate's financial operations for 3 years, she said finally, since Margaret, Mr. Cross's wife, died. Is he competent? He's very competent. Another pause. He had certain things. Mrs. Drummond. Harriet looked at her with sharp, tired eyes. Get some sleep, Miss Vane. The office will tell you more than I can. She left without explaining that last remark. Nora undressed in the cold and lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the silence of a place far removed from everything she'd known. No printing presses, no coal smoke, no boarding house sounds, the particular symphony of other people's nights, their coughs and arguments in the creak of their beds. Just wind and grass that seemed to go on forever. She slept eventually with her mother's letter under her pillow, and the feeling that something in this place was already watching her with more attention than the dark deserved. She woke at 4:45 by habit before anyone knocked and was dressed and downstairs by 5:15. The kitchen was already operational, Harriet moving between stove and preparation counter with the automaticity of long practice. 2 ranch hands at the long table consuming eggs with focused efficiency. They glanced up when Nora entered. One looked away immediately. The other, a man of perhaps 35 with an air of general skepticism, kept looking with the particular assessment of someone who had already formed an opinion and was checking whether the evidence supported it. Davis, Harriet said without turning from the stove. Miss Vane doesn't need your opinions before breakfast. Davis returned to his eggs. Nora sat at the end of the table, ate quickly, listened. The hands talked around her about the day's work, fence mending on the north pasture, 2 mares coming due for the farrier, a supply order that hadn't arrived from Billings. She noted the supply order mentioned in the particular filing cabinet she maintained in her mind for details that would matter later. At 5:30, she was in the office. It was a good-sized room, 2 windows, a large desk, shelves of ledgers along the east wall, a filing cabinet, a smaller table with a chair that had clearly been arranged for secondary work. The desk itself was a controlled disaster, stacks of papers in no apparent organizational system, a tray of mail that had clearly been processed only by the criterion of physical location rather than content. 3 different ledger volumes opened simultaneously to different pages. Nora set down her coffee, pulled the nearest ledger toward her, and began. Within 20 minutes, she understood what Everett had meant by disaster. Within 40, she understood something he hadn't mentioned. The books were not merely disorganized. They were specifically carefully disorganized in a way that looked like chaos but wasn't. The chaos had direction. Supply costs were scattered across 3 different ledger categories in a way that would prevent a casual reviewer from totaling them accurately. Vendor payments were recorded in a sequence that bore no relationship to chronology, but had a different kind of internal consistency she couldn't immediately parse. And the filing cabinet, when she opened it, revealed contracts and correspondence organized by a system she'd need time to decode, if it was a system at all, and not simply misdirection. She was sitting very still, looking at an invoice for winter grain from Anderson's feed supply, an invoice that listed a price of $47 per hundredweight, when the territorial standard that year was 26 to 29 when the door opened. Wade Cross came in like a man who owned the room. He was younger than Everett by several years, perhaps 36, 37, and where Everett's face had the weathered quality of someone who spent his days outside doing things that mattered, Wade's had the more careful maintenance of someone who spent time on his appearance. He was handsome, the kind of handsome that knew it. He wore a good coat and boots that had been polished recently, which was not in Nora's experience a ranching necessity. He stopped when he saw her. "You're the new wife." He said it with a smile that was warm and immediate, the smile of a man practiced at generating good impressions. Everett mentioned he'd gone ahead and used choosing night this year. "I didn't know the lucky lady was already installed." "I arrived last night," Nora said. "I'm Wade Cross, Everett's cousin. I handle the ranch operations, supply contracts, financial management, vendor relationships." He crossed to the desk with the unhurried confidence of someone approaching familiar territory and looked at the ledger she'd been reviewing. His eyes tracked to the open page without appearing to a micro-movement she probably wasn't meant to notice. "Getting settled in the office? Getting acquainted with the records, yes. They're a bit complex," he said easily. "Ranch accounting has some peculiarities compared to regular business bookkeeping. Different categories, different timing on payments, seasonal adjustments for livestock values. It takes a while to get the feel of it." He paused just perceptibly. "I'd be happy to walk you through the system I've developed." "That would be helpful," Nora said. "Tomorrow, perhaps. I'd like to spend today reading before we discuss." Something crossed his face so quickly she almost missed it. Not displeasure exactly, more the recalculation of a man who'd offered a distraction and had it politely declined. "Of course, take all the time you need." The warm smile again entirely restored. "Anything specific you want to know about the operation, just ask. Everett relies on me to keep him current on the business side. He has his hands full with the cattle and the land management." "I'll keep that in mind," Nora said. He left. Nora turned back to the Andersons' feed invoice and held it up to the light from the window. She had been a printer's daughter for 26 years. She knew what good paper stock looked like, the weight and texture of different grades, the way ink sat differently on vellum versus rag versus standard commercial stock. This invoice had been printed on paper she didn't recognize. Not wrong exactly, just not quite right. She thought about what it would take to produce a document on paper that would match a vendor's letterhead but wasn't actually from that vendor. Her father had owned a printing press. She knew exactly what it would take. She set the invoice carefully back on the desk and turned to the shelf of older ledger volumes looking for the year 1879. It took her 30 minutes to find what she was looking for, a ledger from January through June of that year, tucked at the back of the second shelf, behind 2 years of cattle vaccination records. The ledger was dusty, hadn't been touched recently. But inside, paperclipped to the inside back cover, was a folded document she almost missed. She opened it. It was a land survey contract, the formal legal recording of the Iron Gate Ranch boundaries as established in 1879, complete with 2 official signatures and a notary seal dated March 14, 1879. The seal was embossed into the heavy paper, the raised letters still crisp. The document showed Iron Gate Ranch at its full extent, 12,000 acres, bounded on the north by the Sage River and on the east by Cutter's Ridge. Nora had seen a different document that morning. In the mail tray, not yet filed, a letter from a company called Montana Rail Consortium, addressed to Wade Cross as financial manager, Iron Gate Holdings, referencing a proposed right-of-way easement agreement for Northern Pacific spur line access as per preliminary terms, established in our correspondence of August 1882. She sat for a long moment with the 1879 survey contract in her hands. An easement for a railroad spur line through Iron Gate Ranch would require, she was not a property attorney, but she had read enough business contracts to know the owner's signature on a deed modification. Not an employee's, not a manager's, the owner's. She looked at the Montana Rail letter again. It was addressed to Wade Cross. She thought about the grain invoice on paper that was almost right but not quite. She thought about the filing system that was designed to obscure totals. She thought about Everett Cross, who had gone to choosing night to find an accountant because his books had been a disaster for 3 years, since his wife died. Since Wade Cross took over the accounts, Nora put the 1879 survey document carefully back between the vaccination records in exactly the position she'd found it and returned to her desk. She picked the Andersons' feed invoice again and began with methodical patience to build a case. How is she, ma'am? She did not see Everett until dinner. He came in from the field with the directness of a man who had been outside doing significant things and wanted to eat and review the day's numbers before sleeping. He was cleaner than she'd expected from someone who'd spent the day on horseback, but carried the particular quality of contained physical energy that Nora associated with people who genuinely liked hard work. Wade was already at the table, easy and sociable, his coat changed and his hair recently combed. He talked about a water rights negotiation with a neighboring ranch, a supply run to Billings planned for next week, the coming winter preparation schedule. Everett listened, asked occasional precise questions, ate with focused efficiency. Nora listened to both of them. She had spent 12 years of her life learning to read the space between what people said and what they meant in her father's shop, in the boarding houses, in every room where a woman needed to understand the dynamics precisely in order to navigate them safely. What she heard listening to Wade Cross talk to Everett Cross was the sound of a performance. Not obviously, not clumsily. Wade was genuinely skilled, but there was a particular quality to the way he framed information. Always positioning himself as Everett's most reliable ally, always subtly establishing that the world outside Iron Gate Ranch was less trustworthy, less competent, less aligned with Everett's interests than Wade himself. It was the framing of a man who needed to be indispensable. Men who were genuinely indispensable did not usually work this hard at the performance of being indispensable. Miss Vane. Wade turned to her with his warm smile. Or I should say Mrs. Cross, I suppose. Are you settling in? The office is useful, she said. The records go back further than I expected. Something very brief happened in his eyes. Yes, I've kept thorough files. It's important to maintain historical records in a ranch operation. Land values, supply costs, they shift significantly year to year. They do, Nora agreed. I noticed some interesting fluctuations in the grain pricing, actually. I'd be curious to understand the pattern. Wade's smile didn't change. As I mentioned, ranch commodity pricing has seasonal variables that don't always look intuitive on paper. I'd be happy to walk you through it. Tomorrow, Nora said pleasantly. As I said, Everett glanced at her across the table. It was the briefest glance, but she caught something in it that she spent 20 minutes examining after dinner, lying in her room with the cold pressing in through the window frame. It was the look of a man who had been watching something happen and was now watching something different happen instead. 3 days into her work in the office, Harriet Drummond appeared in the doorway at 2 in the afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and an expression suggesting she had made a decision. She set a cup on Nora's desk, pulled the second chair to the other side, and sat down without being invited. You found something? Harriet said. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she turned her current ledger page face down. What makes you say that? Because you've been in this office 12 hours a day for 3 days and the expression on your face has been getting progressively more careful. Harriet wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Careful is what people look like when they know something dangerous. Nora studied the older woman. Mrs. Drummond, when I asked you about Wade Cross on my first night here, you told me to read the office records, and they would tell me more than you could. That was not an accident, was it? Harriet said nothing. You've suspected something, Nora said. For a while, but you haven't told Everett. The silence stretched. Harriet set down her coffee cup. He has something over you, Nora said quietly. Wade does. It was, she would think later, the longest pause she had ever waited through. Harriet sat with her hands flat on her thighs, looking not at Nora, but at some middle distance where the past lived. My husband, she said finally, came to Montana Territory in 1871. He changed his name when he arrived. Thomas Drummond was not the name he was born with. In Ohio, under his original name, he was wanted for a financial crime, a business partnership that ended badly, a dispute over assets that his partner resolved by going to the law. She paused. Thomas was a good man here, 11 years on this ranch, never another wrong action. He died in 79, but the record in Ohio doesn't know that. The warrant still exists. And Wade found out. He found out 2 years ago. I don't know how. Harriet's voice was level with effort. He has never threatened me directly. He's too intelligent for direct threats. But he mentioned Thomas's original name to me once in passing in a conversation about something entirely unrelated. Just mentioned it, to let me know he knew. She looked at Nora. If the warrant were acted on, even posthumously, my husband's estate settlement would be voided. I would lose the small income Everett pays me, this position, the only security I have at my age. He silenced you, Nora said. He removed my ability to speak without cost. A pause. It's not quite the same thing. I'm speaking now. Nora thought about that distinction. Why? Because you're better at this than I am, Harriet said simply. I know accounts well enough to see that something is wrong, but I don't know them well enough to prove it. And because she stopped. Then you were rejected 7 times in that hall, and you stood through every one of them without flinching. I watched from the back of the room. I thought if that woman can stand through that, she can stand through Wade Cross. The directness of it disarmed Nora completely. There's more than financial fraud, Nora said after a moment. I suspected. There's a land transaction, a proposed railroad easement. The paperwork involves a contract modification that would require Everett's signature, and I believe Wade has been conducting correspondence with the Montana Rail Consortium as if he has authority to negotiate that modification. Harriet went very still again. If the modification were formalized and signed, Nora continued, Everett would lose the East Passage, Harriet said, the Cutter's Ridge corridor, the most valuable grazing land on the property. Her voice had changed, no longer carefully controlled, but carrying something older and more personal. Margaret Everett's wife, she negotiated the survey boundaries herself. She spent 6 months corresponding with the Territorial Land Office to establish those boundaries legally. The Cutter's Ridge corridor was her work. Nora understood something then about why Everett Cross had gone to choosing night looking for an accountant. I need to verify the notary seal on the 1879 document, she said. Is there a way to contact the Territorial Notary Office in Billings without going through Wade? I can send a letter through the Allgate Supply run Boston, Harriet said. He's the only driver who goes direct to Billings without stopping in town. Wade doesn't know him. I need to do it before Wade knows what I've found. How long? A week? Maybe 10 days. Harriet nodded once decisively in the manner of a woman who had been waiting for someone to give her an objective that was worth the risk of moving. I'll arrange the letter, she said. That evening, Everett knocked on the office door at 7. Nora had been expecting him. She had, in fact, been thinking about this conversation for most of the afternoon. Not what she would say, but how much and when. He came in and looked at the desk, where she had been making careful notes in a separate notebook she kept locked in her case when she wasn't using it. He looked at the ledgers she had organized into 3 separate stacks: original records, invoices, vendor correspondence, and at the small pile of documents she had set to one side. He sat in the second chair without asking. You found something, he said. She thought of Harriet saying the same words 3 hours ago and felt an odd sort of vertigo. Yes, she said, but I need more time to document it fully before I tell you, because what I've found requires corroboration that I don't yet have in hand. If I tell you now and the corroboration doesn't arrive, the person responsible will have time to destroy the evidence. Everett was quiet for a moment. That's a careful answer. It's the accurate one. How long? A week, perhaps less. He looked at the document stacks again. Is it serious? Not a question. Yes, she said. He absorbed this with the same flat containment he'd used to talk about his wife's death on the road from town. Is it Wade? She looked at him steadily. Don't answer that, he said. Not yet. You're right about the timing. He stood. At the door, he paused without turning. The ledgers from the year Margaret was alive, 1876 through 79. Do you have those? Yes, they're in that stack on the left. They're also, she paused. They're well done. She was very good. Silence. Then I know, he said and left. Nora sat in the office for another hour after the lamp in the hall went dark, thinking about the forged notary deed and the grain invoices and the railroad correspondence in the specific surgical way a clever man had been dismantling someone else's life over 3 years. And she thought about the way Everett Cross had said, I know about his dead wife's bookkeeping, about her particular competence, about the quality of work she'd left behind, and how that simple phrase had carried the weight of an entire grief without performing it at all. She was still thinking about it when she finally went to bed. The documentation process took Nora 4 days, and she performed it with the same careful patience her father had applied to typesetting one piece at a time, check twice the whole, only as reliable as each individual element. She worked in the early mornings before the house was fully awake, and in the late evenings after Wade's lamp went dark, and she kept her separate notebook in her case and her case locked and the key on a cord around her neck. She did not think about whether this was excessive caution. She had seen in the grain invoices the kind of careful intelligence that left nothing to chance. She would not leave anything to chance either. By the end of the 4th day, she had documented 19 separate instances of inflated vendor pricing. The pattern was precise Never more than double the market rate on any single item, which would be too obvious, never less than 30% above which would be insufficient to profit meaningfully. The total overcharge across 3 years of supply procurement came to $4,216. For a ranch the size of Iron Gate, this was serious but survivable. It was not, however, the serious thing. The serious thing was the railroad. It took her another 2 days to reconstruct the correspondence thread letters, arriving from Montana Rail Consortium responses, apparently sent from Iron Gate, all filed in a folder labeled Territorial Boundary Issues in the back of the filing cabinet, where a casual reviewer would interpret boundary as a range dispute with a neighbor rather than a proposed easement modification. Wade had been conducting a negotiation in Everett's name for at least 14 months. What he was negotiating was the right-of-way for a Northern Pacific spur line through the eastern quarter of Iron Gate Ranch, through the Cutter's Ridge corridor. The terms in the most recent letter from Montana Rail suggested they were close to final agreement. The proposed payment to Iron Gate, $12,000, paid directly to the financial manager of record. $12,000, a serious sum delivered not to the owner of the land, but to the man managing the paperwork. Nora sat with this information for a long time. She thought about the notary seal on the 1879 survey document. She thought about what it would take to modify a deed with a forged signature. She thought about the Montana Rail letter addressed to Wade Cross, not Everett Cross, and what that suggested about who Montana Rail believed they were actually dealing with. She wrote a careful letter to the Territorial Notary Office in Billings, asking for verification of the seal number on the 1879 Iron Gate survey contract. She framed it as a routine due diligence inquiry from a new property manager reviewing historical records. She gave Harriet's name and the Stage Depot address as the return. Then she folded it twice and gave it to Harriet at breakfast without Wade in the room. On the 6th day of her investigation, Nora made her first mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind that came from working alone in a situation where she needed to talk to someone and didn't have that option. She was reviewing a set of cattle sale records from the previous spring, looking for the same pattern of systematic inflation she'd found in the supply costs. And she failed to notice that Wade Cross had come into the hallway outside the office until he was already paused at the partially open door. She did not know how long he'd been there. When she looked up, he was moving on down the hallway with the casual pace of a man who happened to be walking past. But his eyes, for the half-second before she registered his presence, had been on the specific stack of documents she was working with. She closed the stack and reorganized it to look like routine filing work. That evening at dinner, Wade was particularly charming. He told a story about a territorial land surveyor who'd gotten lost in the crazy mountains for a week and came out convinced he'd found the route to the Pacific. He was funny. Everett listened with the dry reserve of a man who had heard the story before and still found it tolerably amusing. Harriet served without expression, and Wade said over dessert casually to no one in particular, "I've been thinking we should schedule the billing supply run next week. I need to meet with our contacts at the Territorial Land Office about some paperwork." Nora did not look up from her coffee. "What paperwork?" Everett asked. "Just routine boundary documentation, annual review." A pause. "Nothing urgent." "Fine," Everett said. Nora sat in her room that night and thought about timing. She had sent the letter to Billings 4 days ago. A reply, if it came, would take at least another 4 days. Wade was proposing to go to Billings next week, which was 5 days away. The question was whether he was going to the Territorial Land Office to finalize the easement agreement, or whether he had somehow connected her inquiry to the notary office and was going to intercept the reply. The second possibility assumed he was watching her more carefully than she'd established. But after 6 days in the office, she was no longer willing to assume anything about what Wade Cross did or did not know. She needed to move faster. She went to Everett's study at 9 that evening and knocked. "Come in." He was at his own desk with what appeared to be range records, the actual physical management of the cattle operation, not the financials she'd been reviewing. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted to something more alert. She sat without being invited and said, "I have enough to tell you now." He set down his pen. For the next 40 minutes, she laid it out. Not everything she was not yet ready to tell him about the railroad easement without the notary verification, but the financial fraud. 19 documented instances of inflated vendor costs, $4,000 over 3 years. The paper that wasn't quite right. The pattern of deliberate organizational chaos designed to make the theft invisible. She set her notebook on his desk and turned it to the page with her summary. Everett read it in silence. He had very good stillness, not the brittle stillness of someone suppressing reaction, but the genuine quiet of a man who processed information by going deeper, rather than by displaying movement. She watched him read and thought about what it cost to see this kind of evidence about someone he trusted. The grain invoices, he said finally. The paper. Yes, I believe they were printed locally, not from Anderson's stock. I'd need to verify that against your father's. She paused. I'd need to verify against what a local printing capability would produce. But the weight is wrong, the texture is wrong. You'd know. I'd know. He turned a page of her notes, read the totals. 4,000. $4,216. That's what I can document. There may be more in records I haven't reviewed yet. And you think he stopped? I think it's Wade, she said. Yes. The room was quiet for a long moment. In the distance, something moved in the barn, a horse shifting the ordinary sound of a working ranch at night. I need more time before I show you everything, she said. There's additional documentation I'm waiting on, something larger than the supply costs. I sent a letter to the notary office in Billings for verification, and Wade has mentioned going to Billings next week. I'm not certain that's coincidence. He looked at her sharply. You think he knows? I think he may have seen me working with the records he'd prefer I hadn't found. I want to be careful. How much time? The reply from Billings should arrive within 4 to 5 days. If I'm right about what I'll find there, it changes everything. Everett was quiet again. Then Wade is writing to Billings Tuesday. Then I need the reply by Monday. He nodded once. Not agreement exactly, acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that she understood the situation precisely and that the timeline she'd identified was accurate and that she was going to have to work very fast. Is there anything I can do? He said without alerting him. Don't change your behavior toward him. Don't ask questions about the financial records. Continue as normal. While I finish. He looked at her for a moment longer, that amber-eyed assessment that she was learning to read the quality of attention that meant he was evaluating something against his existing model and updating it. You came from choosing night a week ago, he said. You've been here 7 days. Yes, in 7 days you've undone 3 years of. He stopped. How? She thought about her father's print shop. About sitting across the ledger from her father at 10 years old, learning that numbers told stories the way words did, that the discipline of accuracy was a form of respect for the truth. About the Pittsburgh boarding house where she'd found a bookkeeping error that saved a widow 6 months of overcharged rent in the woman's face when she realized someone had noticed. My father taught me to love the work, she said. Accurate books they're not just correct numbers. They're the actual record of what happened. Falsified books aren't just dishonest, they're a kind of erasure. I find that, she paused, intolerable. Something in Everett's expression changed. Not dramatically, no sweeping transformation. Just a specific quality of attention that she felt more than saw. Go get some sleep, he said. I'll leave you to finish. The sabotage started before the reply from Billings arrived. Nora was in the middle of breakfast on her 9th day at Irongate when Jackson Rowe, the ranch's head wrangler, a sun-weathered man of 40, with the economical movements of someone who had worked animals all his life, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a specific quality of expression that meant bad news being held in check. Miss Vane. He looked at Harriet first, then at Nora. Is the boss in? He rode out at first light, Harriet said. North pasture. What's happened? Jackson's jaw moved. 3 horses are missing from the east paddock. Gates intact, latches intact. Meaning the gate had been opened deliberately and then properly relatched afterward by someone who didn't want it to look like a break-in. How long have they been gone? Nora asked. Since sometime overnight. They were in at last check 8 o'clock. Nora stood. Can you send a rider to find Everett? Yes, ma'am, but Jackson stopped. But it's not technically your call to make, she said. Mr. Cross left me in charge of the house operations while he's away. Is that how you understand it? Jackson looked at her for a moment. He was not a man whose face showed a great deal, but she caught the specific evaluation. New woman. Unknown quantity of 7 rejections in a public hall arrived out of nowhere. He was deciding whether the authority was real. Yes, ma'am, he said finally. That's how I understand it. Send a rider for Everett. Take 2 hands and search the east drainage in the creek bed they'll have gone for water. I'll review the night watch schedule for the east paddock. Jackson left. Harriet looked at Nora over the kitchen table. You said it started. I think so, Nora said. Yes.
Mush.
Active to Mama. They found two of the three horses by midday grazing peacefully by the creek 2 miles east. The third, a gray mare named Cinder that Everett had bred himself, was gone. Everett returned from the north pasture and heard the report in his study without visible reaction. He looked at the night watch schedule Nora had pulled, which showed that the East Paddock watch had been assigned to a hand named Ollie Birch, who Nora had learned from Jackson had been in town the previous evening and had returned visibly delayed. Birch had been hired 18 months ago by Wade. Nora did not say this at the dinner table that evening. She wrote it in her notebook and kept the notebook in her case. Wade was sympathetic about the horses. "Terrible thing," he said. "That gray was a good animal. Fencing on the east side must need work. I've been meaning to flag that for weeks." He shook his head with appropriate regret. "I'll arrange a full perimeter review before winter." Everett said nothing. Nora watched Wade cut his steak with the neat efficiency of a man with no concerns and thought about how very good he was at this and how long he had been practicing. The second incident came 3 days later. Nora was in the office when she smelled it. Not immediately alarming, just a faint wrong note in the air that sharpened into something more serious as she stepped into the hall. Harriet was already moving toward the back of the house. "Feed storage," Harriet said. The winter feed barn held 60 bags of oats recently purchased for the horse operation. When they opened the doors, the smell hit them fully, the sharp, green, rotten odor of grain that has gotten wet and gone to mold. Not just damp-soaked. Someone had introduced water deliberately, probably 2 nights ago, based on how far the spoilage had progressed. 60 bags, nearly 300 pounds of premium oats. Davis, one of the hands, came to look and stood in the barn doorway with his arms crossed. "Bad luck," he said in a tone that did not sound like he believed in bad luck. "This isn't luck," Nora said. "This was deliberate." Davis's eyes shifted. "Can't know that for certain. Condensation, bad storage." "The bags in the back are dry," Nora said. "If it were condensation or a leak in the roof, the distribution would be different. The front row bags have been specifically targeted." She kept her voice level. "I'd like you to check the north wall for evidence of deliberate water introduction." Davis looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite hostility, more the specific resistance of a man who has decided an authority is not legitimate, but doesn't want to say so directly. "I'll take a look," he said, and did not. That evening, Nora heard voices in the bunkhouse as she passed, not words, just tone. The particular quality of men discussing something with the energy of people who have an opinion and enough safety to share it. The words she caught the clearest syllable were 7 times. She kept walking. That night, she took stock. She was 12 days into her time at Iron Gate Ranch. She had documented evidence of $4,000 in financial fraud. She was waiting on verification of what she suspected was a much larger crime. The sabotage had begun, not dramatically, but it had begun, and it had begun before she'd confronted anyone, which meant Wade had noticed her attention even before the incident in the hallway, which meant he was better at surveillance than she'd given him credit for. She needed the notary verification, and she needed it before Tuesday. She was considering options when she heard the sound. It was faint, the particular quality of a sound outside a window that shouldn't be there. She'd grown up above a print shop in a Pittsburgh neighborhood where the streets were never fully quiet. She'd developed good pattern recognition for sounds that were wrong. She went to the window. Below in the yard between the house and the main barn, a figure stood in the shadow of the porch overhang. She couldn't see the face, but she could see the quality of the stillness. A person standing still in the dark near someone's house was either waiting or watching, and neither of those was reassuring. She watched for 3 minutes. The figure didn't move. Then a lamp came on in one of the bunkhouse windows, throwing a wedge of light across the yard, and the figure moved out of the shadow. Wade Cross walked back toward the guest wing of the house with the casual pace of a man who had simply stepped outside for air. Nora stood at the window for a long time after he'd gone in. She did not sleep much that night. The letter from Billings arrived on Sunday morning. Harriet brought it to her in the office with a face carefully composed to blankness. Not because she was unaware of its contents, she clearly was, but because composure was Harriet Drummond's armor, and she wore it in the moments that mattered most. Nora opened the letter. Read it twice. The Territorial Notary Office confirmed that seal number 1879-MT-0341 had been issued to Notary Public James Aldridge of Billings on the date recorded on the Iron Gate survey document. Further, Mr. Aldridge was still living. He was 81 years old and resident at his son's home on the north side of Billings, and could, if required, confirm his seal in the circumstances of its application. The seal on the 1879 survey document was legitimate, which meant the deed modification being used in the Montana Rail Consortium correspondence was not. Nora sat for a very long time with the letter on her desk and the weight of what she was looking at settling into her bones. This was not bookkeeping fraud. This was forgery. This was the fraudulent conveyance of real property. This was if she was reading the territorial statutes she'd found in the law reference section of the office bookshelf correctly, a crime that carried 10 to 15 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. This was the reason that Wade Cross, if he discovered what she'd found, would not simply try to discredit her. He would try to silence her. She was sitting with this thought, with her hands flat on the desk and her mind very quiet, when Everett knocked and came in. He took one look at her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. It was not the kind of scene she had imagined when she'd rehearsed this conversation. She had imagined a controlled disclosure documents, in order evidence presented with clinical precision. What she had not imagined was Everett Cross sitting very still in the chair across from her desk, while she laid out the proof that his cousin had spent 3 years systematically stealing his ranch. He was quiet throughout. He did not interrupt. He asked 2 clarifying questions, once about the consortium letter dates, once about the notary verification, and both questions were precise and relevant, and showed that he was following the documentation with full comprehension. When she finished, he sat for a long moment without speaking. "Margaret's work," he said finally. She understood what he meant. The Cutter's Ridge corridor, the eastern boundary, survey the 6 months of correspondence his wife had spent establishing those legal limits. The work that Wade was in the process of selling off. "Yes," she said. He stood up. Not in agitation, there was something about the way Everett Cross moved that was almost never agitated, but with the quality of a man who has received information and has now transitioned into action. "I need to think about how to approach this. He's going to Billings Tuesday." "I know." His jaw tightened fractionally. "I'll cancel the Billings trip." "He'll know why." "Possibly." He looked at her. "Are these the only copies of your documentation?" "I have duplicates in my case." "Keep the duplicates on your person, not in the case, on your person." She understood what he was telling her. "You think he'll try to destroy them?" "I think when I tell him he's not going to Billings, and when he starts to understand why the timeline accelerates." He paused. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected from a man of his evident caution about displays of feeling, but because it was asked with the specific directness that meant he actually wanted to know. "I'm functioning," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No." She folded her hands on the desk. "It isn't, but it's what I have right now, and it's sufficient." He held her gaze for a moment, those amber eyes, the quality of attention in them that she had been learning to read as its own language. Then he said, "Don't go outside alone after dark." She thought about the figure in the yard. "I wasn't planning to." He left. Nora sat in the office after he'd gone and let herself for exactly 5 minutes feel the full weight of what she'd found and what it meant and what was coming. Then she folded that feeling precisely and put it in the same place she kept her fear, and turned back to the documentation and began organizing it for the confrontation she knew was now. Whatever Everett's careful planning, only days away. On Monday evening, Everett told Wade the Billings trip was postponed. He did it at dinner with the same even tone he applied to everything in front of both Nora and Harriet. He gave a reason a problem with the Morrison fence line that needed his personal attention Tuesday that was reasonable enough to be credible. But Nora watched Wade receive the information. His face did everything it was supposed to do: mild surprise, easy understanding, casual regret. His hands continued cutting his food with the same neat efficiency as always. But for exactly 1/3 of a second before the surface performance engaged, she saw the flicker of rapid calculation behind his eyes, not fear. Something colder than fear. Decision. She kept her own face perfectly composed and reached under the table to touch briefly the folded pages she'd tucked into her skirt pocket, her summary notes, the notary letter 3 of the most unambiguous vendor invoices. Not all the documentation she'd cached that in 2 separate locations in the house, but enough to establish the pattern if anything happened to the rest. The dinner continued. Wade told a story about a neighbor's land dispute. Nora drank her coffee and thought about how very close everything was now to breaking. The That night, she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of her office door opening. She was not in the office, she was in her room, but she could hear it, the careful movement of the office door, which had a specific catch in its mechanism she'd identified on her first day, a sound she'd memorized because she was the kind of person who memorized such things. She lay still for 30 seconds, thinking clearly. Her duplicate documentation was in her room in two separate places. The key pages in her coat pocket, which was on the chair by the window, and the fuller set folded and sewn into the lining of the coat itself, a precaution she'd taken after seeing Wade in the yard. Whatever was happening in the office, she was in her room. She got up, quietly dressed, and went to the door. The hallway was dark. The line of light under the office door was gone, or rather it showed the movement of a shielded lamp being used carefully. She stood at the junction of the corridor and thought about her options. She could go wake Everett. She could go to the office and confront whoever was there. She could do neither and wait. She went to Everett's room, which was at the west end of the hall, and knocked quietly. Once, then twice in the rhythm they'd established as a signal after Sunday's conversation. He opened the door in perhaps 20 seconds, already dressed, which told her he had not been sleeping either. "Office," she said quietly. He moved past her down the hall without asking questions. She followed. Everett opened the office door. The shielded lamp was sitting on the desk. The filing cabinet was open, the drawer she'd been working from, the one with the Montana Rail correspondence. The space where the original Montana Rail folder had been was empty. The room was otherwise undisturbed. Whoever had been there was gone. Everett picked up the lamp and looked at the empty drawer space for a long moment. Then he put the lamp down and looked at Nora. "The railroad correspondence," she said. "I made copies. Harriet helped me transcribe 3 of the most critical letters last week. They're in her room along with my secondary documentation set." He absorbed this without expression. "You anticipated this. I thought the timeline was accelerating. I prepared for it." The look he gave her then was not the assessing amber survey she'd grown accustomed to. It was different, something she couldn't immediately categorize, something that felt like being genuinely seen by someone who was not in the habit of looking. In the morning, he said, "We confront him." "Yes," she said. "Get some sleep." She went back to her room and did not sleep at all, but she lay in the dark and held the pages in her coat against her chest and told herself that she was ready. Sage Flats had opinions about Nora Cross. In the weeks after choosing night and before the full weight of the Iron Gate situation became public knowledge, the town processed her the way small communities in isolated territories processed unusual arrivals, with a combination of curiosity, suspicion, and the kind of half-formed narrative that filled in gaps with whatever was most satisfying. The most popular version went something like this. Everett Cross, lonely after 6 years of widowhood and never managing his ranch accounts properly since Margaret died, had seen something at choosing night and acted on it. What he'd seen was debatable. Desperation, some said, a lonely man finding the most available woman in the room. A canny eye for a deal, others said, getting a bookkeeper without paying bookkeeper wages. Something odder and less definable, said a few. The second most popular version was darker. The new wife had engineered the situation. She'd come from Pittsburgh with nothing. She'd been rejected 7 times. She'd been desperate. And Everett Cross was the wealthiest unmarried man in the territory. The 7 rejections in this version were not evidence of her inadequacy, but of her calculation failing 6 times and succeeding on the 7th. What the town did not know in those first weeks was that there was a third version, the true one, which was significantly more complicated and interesting than either of the popular narratives. The proprietor of the Sage Flats General Store, a man named Thomas Callister, had a perspective on things that was shaped by 16 years of watching the community's transactions in both the commercial and social sense. He'd seen Everett Cross come in for supplies twice in the weeks before choosing night, once in person, which was unusual for a man who usually sent ranch hands for routine purchases, and once with what appeared to be a specific inquiry about a particular person. He hadn't heard the name mentioned, but he'd noted the quality of Everett's attention during the inquiry, focused precise, the attention of a man building a picture rather than satisfying casual curiosity. When Nora Cross came into his store a week after arriving at Iron Gate, Callister had been watching for exactly what he found: not the nervous calculation of a woman who had landed an advantageous situation and was working to secure it, but the practical efficiency of someone who had work to do and was doing it. She bought what was on her list. She checked the prices against her memory of market rates. She said thank you without performing gratitude. He told his wife that evening that in his opinion the story was more interesting than people thought. His wife had already formed her own opinions, being the kind of woman who processed information faster than most. She found something in those books, she said. How would you know? Because she's been in that office every day since she arrived, and she has the look of someone untangling something large. She poured the evening tea. Thomas, that ranch has been going wrong for 3 years, and everyone has wondered why. He thought about the grain prices he'd been paid above market consistently for 36 months in a way that had been good for his business and that he hadn't questioned as carefully as he perhaps should have. He thought about what he knew about Wade Cross's reputation for generosity and how generosity that came from someone else's money was a particular kind of confidence trick. I should talk to her, he said. You should mind your own accounts, his wife said firmly. She's doing fine without your involvement. She was not wrong. But he remembered when the fire happened and the arrest happened and the full scope of the fraud became public that he had seen it coming in the quality of her attention and had done exactly what his wife recommended, minded his own accounts. And he thought about whether that was what decent people in a community were supposed to do. He was still thinking about it when Nora Cross appeared in his store a second time in the aftermath of the fire and bought lamp oil and flour and smoked pork for a ranch that was rebuilding. He gave her a discount on the lamp oil. It was not nothing. It was in his particular ledger of community behavior what he had available to offer. She thanked him without excessive ceremony and noted the discount in her supply record with the careful precision of someone who maintained accurate books, which he now understood was both her profession and her character. There was another person in Sage Flats who saw the situation from a particular angle. His name was Samuel Whitfield, the young man who had been the first to approach Nora at choosing night and the first to decline her with the words, "too much risk." He was 24 years old, earnest, and in possession of the specific variety of honest self-assessment that made a person useful to have around once they stopped confusing their limitations for principles. He had watched Everett Cross stand up and cross that hall and felt a specific quality of feeling that he spent 2 weeks refusing to name. It was not jealousy exactly. It was the feeling of having looked at a thing clearly and still missed it, the specific cost of choosing the safe assessment over the accurate one. He ran into Nora Cross 2 months after the fire outside the saddle shop on Main Street. She was alone, moving with the purpose of someone with a destination, and she nearly walked past him before he said her name. She stopped and turned. She did not look at him with anger, which surprised him. She looked at him with the specific expression of a person who has filed something in the appropriate location and has moved on. "Miss Vane, Mrs. Cross," he corrected himself. "I wanted to say, it's all right," she said. "You don't know what I was going to say." "You were going to say you were wrong," she said. "And you're welcome to say it, but I don't need it to feel differently about what happened, so say it for your own sake if it helps." He looked at her. She was not being unkind. She was being accurate, which was he was learning a different thing entirely. "I was wrong," he said, "not about the risk. You were a risk. I'm not going to pretend I was wrong about that part. But I was wrong about whether the risk was worth taking." She considered this. "What changed your mind?" "You walked into a burning barn," he said. "4 horses." She looked slightly impatient. "People have been commending me for that for weeks. It was a practical decision. Those horses were Iron Gate's breeding stock, and their loss would have—" "It wasn't practical," he said, "not to anyone watching from outside." A pause. "All right," she said, "it was not entirely practical, but the horses are fine." She looked at him with something that was not warmth exactly, but was not its absence either. "You asked if I had family out here. I didn't then. I do now." She looked back toward the direction of Iron Gate Ranch, which was not visible from Main Street, but was present in the direction she looked. The way things you belonged to were present in which direction you naturally faced. "Whatever I lacked at choosing night, I've been building it since." She paused. "That was always going to be true whether you chose me or not." He thought about that for a long time after she'd gone. He thought about what it meant that she'd been building, not waiting to be given what she needed, but building it. He thought about the distinction between worth that was demonstrated in conventional terms and worth that was built over time by doing the work. He thought about how 7 men had seen the absence of the first kind and missed the presence of the second. He did not stop thinking about it for several years. It became eventually the thing that most substantially changed the way he looked at the world. Not any single insight, but the cumulative effect of watching Nora Cross build Iron Gate's accounts and employment program, and the vote that ended choosing night and understanding slowly that worth was not a fixed quantity assessed on a single evening. "It was a story you were in the middle of writing?" The breakfast table was a battleground before the first word was spoken. Nora had learned in the 2 weeks she'd been at Irongate to read the atmosphere of a room the way she read a ledger column, not for the stated totals, but for what the pattern revealed underneath. What she read at the breakfast table on Tuesday morning was this: Wade Cross had spent the night recalibrating. He had taken the files he'd come for. He had not found the copies. And he did not know whether Everett had been told. So he was performing breakfast. The performance was exquisite. She had to acknowledge that. He was warm, engaged, present, the picture of a man with clear conscience starting a productive day. He talked about the fence problem on the Morrison line with the appropriate degree of interest. He asked Harriet about the week's supply needs. He spoke to Nora with courteous familiarity. Nora ate her eggs and said very little and watched the performance the way she'd watch a ledger with hidden fraud, not looking for where it admitted to the problem, but for the structural pressure points where it tried too hard to conceal. The pressure point was this: Wade had not asked about the Billings trip rescheduling. It had been postponed yesterday evening. A man with genuine curiosity about the Morrison fence problem and its impact on his schedule would have asked. Wade had not, because asking would invite the conversation he was currently working to delay. Everett came in last and sat at the head of the table. "Wade," he said, not a greeting, a statement of territory. The performance flickered for half a second. "Morning, Everett." Easy, warm. "How's the Morrison situation looking?" "There is no Morrison situation," Everett said. Silence. "I created a reason to cancel your Billings trip," Everett continued in the same level tone he applied to everything, "because I needed another evening before this conversation. Nora." He looked at her. She opened her coat, took out the folded papers, and set them on the table. Wade looked at the papers. Then he looked at Nora. Then he looked at Everett, and the warmth in his face, not all of it, but the part that was performance, went quiet. "What is this?" he said. "Vendor invoices from the past 3 years," Nora said, cross-referenced with territorial commodity prices for the same periods. Annotated with the specific discrepancies between what Irongate was billed and what the market rate was. Prices fluctuate, not by 30 to 100% consistently in the same direction across 19 separate transactions over 36 months. She kept her voice level. "I also have here a letter from the Territorial Notary Office in Billings confirming the authenticity of the seal on the 1882 Irongate survey document, the original 1879 document, I mean. The one filed in the land records." She paused. "And copies of your correspondence with the Montana Rail Consortium." Something shifted in Wade's face. It was not quite fear. It was the specific recalibration of a man who has been operating under one set of assumptions and is now receiving information that requires a complete reassessment. "You went through my private correspondence," he said. "Your private correspondence was filed in the Irongate business records," Nora said, "under territorial boundary issues. In your capacity as financial manager of Irongate Ranch, those records belong to Everett." "Everett?" Wade turned to his cousin with the specific quality of appeal that men who were very good at relationships deployed in extremity, the implicit reminder of history, loyalty, shared blood. "Are you listening to this? She's been here 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and she's making accusations that—" "They're not accusations," Everett said. "They're documentation." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Nora had been in rooms where the structural load shifted, a printing press tipping wrong, the moment just before a stack of type crashed, and she felt that quality now in the stillness of the breakfast table. "The Montana Rail easement," Everett said. "How far did it go?" Wade's jaw was tight. He looked at Nora with something that was moving past recalculation into something else. "It was for the good of the ranch," he said. "The railroad payment would have cleared all of Irongate's debt, given you capital to expand. I was managing the negotiation because you were—" He stopped. "Because I was what?" Everett said quietly. "Because after Margaret died, you weren't—" Wade's voice had shifted tone entirely, moving away from performance into something that might have been genuine, or might have been the next performance. Nora found she could no longer tell. "I stepped up because you needed me to. I handled the operations because the ranch needed to run. And yes, I made arrangements because someone had to, because you were walking around this ranch for 2 years like you were waiting to die with her." "That's enough," Everett said. The 2 words stopped the room. "You weren't managing assets for my benefit," Everett said. "You were managing them for yours. The $12,000 payment from Montana Rail, it would have gone to you." "I was going to—" "Don't." The single syllable was not raised in volume. It didn't need to be. "Don't tell me what you were going to do. Tell me what you did." The silence that followed was one of the most uncomfortable things Nora had ever sat through. Wade looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Everett. He looked at Nora, and what was in his face when he looked at her was no longer calculation or performance or warmth. It was the particular cold of a man who has decided who is responsible for his situation. "Pack your things," Everett said. "You'll leave Irongate today. I'll give you the horse you came with and 2 days' supply. That's the arrangement." "This is half my family," Wade said. "You can't just—" "Half my family has been stealing from this ranch for 3 years and attempting to sell my land without my consent." Everett's voice stayed level. "I'm not pressing criminal charges. That's the only courtesy I'm offering. Take it. Criminal charges." Wade's voice changed again, and this time there was no performance at all. Only the cold anger of a man who has been cornered and knows it and is already thinking past the immediate moment to the next position. "On whose evidence hers?" He looked at Nora, a woman who was rejected by 7 men in this territory and latched onto the richest one available. A woman who arrived with nothing and has been working alone in your office with access to every financial record on this property. He paused. "I wonder what a judge would make of an accusation like this. New wife, no history here, no family vouching for her, making allegations against a man with 3 years of service to this ranch." Nora felt the words hit not the 7 rejections part. She'd spent 14 days building armor against that specific blow, but the structural argument. He wasn't wrong that a territorial court would look at her credentials and his with different weights. "She's not the one filing charges," Everett said. "I am. Based on her work. Based on evidence. Evidence she produced." Wade stood up. "Take it to Sheriff Pryor. See what he makes of it." And something in his voice on that sentence, a particular confidence that should not have been there, given the situation, made the back of Nora's neck go cold. Wade left the table without eating and went to his room. Nora looked at the papers in front of her. Then she looked at Everett. "Sheriff Pryor," she said. Everett's expression did not change, but she saw his jaw tighten once. "I'll handle Pryor." "Do you know why he said it that way, about taking it to Pryor specifically?" Everett looked at her. "There's more in the correspondence," she said carefully. "Things I haven't shown you yet. Things that connect to, I think there may be a relationship between Wade and Pryor. A financial one." Everett was very still. "I found a letter," she said. "In the same file, it was addressed to Pryor. I wasn't certain of its implications when I first read it, but in context." "Show me." She did. The letter was brief, just 5 lines referencing a consulting arrangement and a payment of $400 for services in the matter of territorial boundary review. Unsigned, but with Wade's distinctive handwriting, which she had by now spent enough time reading to recognize immediately. Everett read it twice. "He's been paying the sheriff," Nora said. "Not enough to own him," Everett said, "but enough to buy his inattention." They looked at each other across the table in the empty breakfast room, the half-eaten plates still in front of them, and Nora felt the dimensions of the problem fully for the first time. Wade Cross had not merely been stealing and forging. He had been building infrastructure leverage against anyone who might come for him. The silencing of Harriet, the sheriff's inattention, the town's established affection for him as a generous, social, likable presence, the 7 rejections in the hall which he would use if it came to a public confrontation to reframe Nora as an opportunist rather than a witness. It was, she thought, the work of a genuinely intelligent man. She could acknowledge that even now. It was also, she was absolutely certain, the kind of work that ended badly for everyone involved, because the kind of intelligence that built this kind of structure eventually believed too much in its own invulnerability. Wade had not expected her. "What do you want to do?" she said. Everett was quiet for a moment. "Do you trust the Billings Notary Office?" The letter came from a verified official source. "Yes." "Is there a federal land office contact above the territorial level?" she thought. "There's a U.S. General Land Office surveyor based in Helena. Federal jurisdiction, above the territorial court system and above any sheriff's consulting arrangements." "Can you write that letter?" "Yes." "Write it today," he said, "while I handle Wade's departure." Wade left Irongate at 3 in the afternoon on the horse he'd arrived with. He rode south toward town with a single saddlebag, and he did not look back. The hands watched from the bunkhouse in the yard in varying states of comprehension and opinion. Nora heard from Harriet's report that Davis had said openly it was a waste of the best ranch manager they'd had, that the new wife had done something unforgivable, and that this would end badly. Harriet had, by Harriet's own account, told Davis that his opinion was neither requested nor relevant, and he could apply that energy to the south pasture fence he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. Davis had apparently decided the south pasture fence was very important after all. That evening, Nora sat on the porch steps in the last of the day's light and felt the specific exhaustion of a sustained effort concluding. Not finishing, not yet. The letter to Helena was written, and with Harriet for the Allgate delivery route. The confrontation had happened. The documentation was secured. But Wade Cross had ridden towards Sage Flats, and she had seen his face when he looked at her across the breakfast table, and she knew that what she'd read there was not defeat. It was an interim position. You should eat something, Everett said. She hadn't heard him come out. He stood a few feet away, looking at the same horizon she'd been looking at, the long curve of the Sage Flats range going gold and then amber in the descending light. I ate, she said. You moved things around your plate. That counts. He sat on the top step a few feet from her. He had changed out of his work clothes and was in the plain dark coat he'd worn to choosing night, which she'd begun to understand was what he put on for the things that required a different quality of attention. Tell me something, she said. About what? About how you knew to go to choosing night. You said you'd had inquiries made. You said you needed someone who would ask the right questions. She looked at him. But you went to choosing night rather than offering an employment contract. Why? He was quiet for a moment. The horizon went from amber to rose. I told you, he said. Authority. A wife would have standing that an employee wouldn't. That's part of it. Silence. What's the rest, she said. He looked at the horizon a long time. She'd learned to wait. Everett Cross was a man who meant what he said and therefore took time to be sure what he meant before he said it. 3 weeks ago, he said, when my man in town first mentioned you, I asked him what you'd done at the stage depot. He told me about the discrepancy you'd found, and he told me something else. He paused. He said when you found it, the first thing you did was double-check. Not once, 3 times. You found the error, and your response was to question whether you were right. She waited. Someone who was going to come to this ranch and falsify records, or help someone falsify records, or collude with what Wade was doing would not triple-check their own work. They'd find the error and use it. The checking was, he stopped. Was what, she said. Character, he said. You could have parlayed the discovery into leverage at the depot. They'd have given you a permanent position to keep you quiet and keep you checking for them. You found the error and reported it accurately, and then you kept your mouth shut when they hired a man instead. A pause. That told me more than the work itself. Nora looked at the horizon. She thought about those 3 weeks in Sage Flats, the careful triple-checking, the report delivered without drama, the walk home from the stage depot after they let her go, and the specific quality of loneliness that came from doing the right thing in a context where it didn't advantage you. You were watching, she said. I was paying attention, he said. There's a difference. She thought about the 7 rejections. She thought about standing in that hall and having her absence of resources, no land, no family, nothing held against her in public. She thought about Charles Vaughn saying he needed a wife who wouldn't find problems where he'd rather not have them found. Those men at choosing night, she said, the 7 who said no, do you think any of them suspected there was something worth finding in me? Everett turned to look at her. The last of the light caught his face at an angle that made the amber of his eyes very clear. Some of them were afraid of you, he said with a precision that suggested he had thought about this. You walked into that hall with nothing to perform and nothing to hide, and some men find that more frightening than any deficiency. He paused. Vaughn did. He said it directly. He wanted a wife who wouldn't find problems he'd rather not find. He had problems he wanted to hide. Most men in that hall had problems they wanted to hide. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the dry precision she'd inherited from her father, then I suppose I saved 7 men from a worse fate than they realized. She did not expect the sound that came from Everett, then brief and involuntary, the contained laugh of a man who was not in the habit of laughing but had been genuinely caught off guard. She turned to look at him and found him looking back with something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not warmth exactly, she was beginning to think warmth was not his primary language, but a kind of recognition. The look of a man who had expected to find a practical arrangement and had found something else as well, and was examining it with the careful attention he gave all things that surprised him. Get some sleep, he said, the usual closing of an evening's conversation between them. But his voice carried something it hadn't before, not quite softness, but the adjacent quality, the acknowledgement of something present in the space between 2 people that had not been there before. She went inside. See you. The real sabotage started 4 days after Wade left. She should have expected it sooner. In retrospect, she thought Wade had spent those 4 days in town, at the boarding house, at the saloon, in the offices of people who owed him favors or whose financial interests aligned with his building the next move. Because what began on the 5th day after his departure was not the work of an impulsive man acting in anger. It was the work of a careful man executing a plan. The first event, Jackson found 2 cattle dead in the south pasture at dawn. Bovine in reasonable health the day before, no visible signs of illness, no expected cause. The territorial veterinarian brought out from town at Everett's request shook his head and looked at the water trough near where they'd been found. Something in the water, he said. Can't tell you what without a proper analysis. But the mucus and the abdominal distension, this was an illness. Poisoned. 2 head of registered breeding stock worth $400 combined. That same day, Nora rode into Sage Flats for a supply run that couldn't be delayed. Iron Gate was low on lamp oil and several staple supplies that affected the ranch's winter readiness. She went with one of the younger hands, a boy named Tom, who was 19 and straightforward and had shown her in the past 2 weeks no hostility. The general store went quiet when she came in. Loretta Shaw was there with her mother. Loretta looked at Nora with the specific expression of a beautiful woman who has been told a story about someone and has decided to believe it. Mrs. Cross, she said, her voice carrying to everyone in the store. We heard about Wade's departure. Quite sudden. Business decisions sometimes are, Nora said. Of course. Loretta's smile was immaculate. Though I've heard various accounts of what precipitated it, some people are saying she stopped with a theatrical consideration. Well, I suppose there are always multiple versions of a story. What version have you heard? Nora said. That you came to Iron Gate and spent 2 weeks going through financial records looking for a reason to remove the man who'd been managing things competently for 3 years. That you didn't like that Everett trusted Wade more than he trusted you, which, given that you'd been there 2 weeks versus Wade's 3 years, seems entirely reasonable. And you manufactured something to shift the balance. Loretta tilted her head. That's what I've heard. Nora looked at her for a moment. She thought about several responses: the documentation, the forged deed, the railroad correspondence, the $4,000. She thought about the fact that if she named any of it here in the general store, it would be retold and reframed and twisted before it reached 4 other ears. I heard something too, Nora said instead. I heard that you're a highly intelligent woman who knows how to read a situation accurately. So I'll leave it at that and let you form your own conclusions when the full story comes out. She turned to the clerk. 12 gallons of lamp oil, 2 sacks of flour, and whatever smoked pork you have in stock, please. She heard Loretta behind her. What an odd woman. The clerk helped her load without much conversation. When she went to pay, he looked at her with something she identified as curiosity rather than hostility. You're the one keeping Iron Gate's books, he said. I am. Wade Cross handled the ordering for 3 years, he said. Paid well above market on some things. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Thought that was odd at the time, but we don't complain when someone's paying over market. He counted her change. Don't mean I think you're wrong, he added at lower volume. She took her change and thanked him. The second event came 2 days later. The chicken house was broken into in the night. Not broken exactly. The door was open from outside with knowledge of how the latch worked. Something had been admitted, or the hens had been spooked into stampede. 17 birds died. It was the kind of loss that a large ranch could absorb. It was also the kind of loss that accumulated, taken together with the horses, the grain, the cattle, into a pattern that told a story. The story was this: ranch is being mismanaged. The person mismanaging it is the new wife who doesn't know what she's doing and has no right to be here. Nora heard this story in the changed quality of conversations that stopped when she walked near. She heard it in Davis's careful public neutrality that was much worse than open hostility. She heard it in the way 2 of the younger hands who had previously been perfectly respectful were now subtly deferring to Davis's lead rather than Jackson's. And she heard it most clearly when, on the 8th day after Wade's departure, she rode into town for a second supply run and encountered Sheriff Dent Pryor outside the trading post. Pryor was a man of 50, with the weathered face of someone who had spent 30 years being asked to do things he'd agreed to under conditions he'd have preferred to renegotiate later. He looked at Nora with the specific, careful expression of a man who was not hostile, but was very interested in appearing neutral. Mrs. Cross, he said, how are things at Iron Gate? Fine, thank you, Sheriff. I heard about the livestock losses. Unfortunate. Ranch life always something going wrong. Yes, she said, though there are some things that go wrong naturally and some things that are assisted. He looked at her for a moment. That's a serious suggestion. I'm a serious person. If you had evidence of deliberate harm to animals or property, I'd bring it to you, she said. Of course. Have you had any contact with Wade Cross since he left Iron Gate? The pause was very small. Most people would not have caught it. I see various people in town, Pryor said carefully. It's a small territory. Of course. Nora looked at him with the level of attention she'd been giving ledger columns for 2 weeks. I found a reference to a consulting arrangement in the Iron Gate financial records. A payment to you for services in the matter of territorial boundary review. I want to make sure I've recorded it correctly. Was that for the 1879 survey review or something more recent? The pause was not small this time. Pryor looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been caught in something and is currently deciding how to categorize the person who caught him. She held his gaze without blinking. I need to review my own records, he said finally. Of course, she said again. I'll let you do that. She inclined her head politely and moved past him into the trading post. Her hands inside her gloves were not quite shaking. She stood in the trading post for a moment with her back to the door, letting her breathing settle, and thought that was either very smart or very foolish. And the difference between those two outcomes depends entirely on how quickly the Helena letter gets a response. What's that? Said I meant soon. That evening, she told Everett about the prior conversation. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him working through the implications. You gave him a signal, he said. I let him know I know, she said. Yes, I thought if he believes there's documented evidence of the payment and that evidence is in federal hands through the Helena letter, then acting against us becomes a risk for him rather than a service to Wade. Or he goes to Wade and tells him exactly how exposed you are. That's the other possibility, she agreed. But I think Pryor isn't ambitious. I think Wade paid him for inattention, not for active assistance. Pryor is a man who finds it easier to look away than to act. Letting him know that I know about the payment should be enough to make him continue looking away, but in a direction that doesn't disadvantage us. Everett studied her. You're operating on a reading of his character from one encounter. I'm operating on a reading of the consulting payment amount, which was $400 in the direction of the consulting boundary review, not enforcement. A sheriff who wanted real influence over an operation like Iron Gate would have asked for more and asked for more useful services. Wade paid for the minimum that would keep him clear. Pryor accepted the minimum. She folded her hands. That tells me what both of them are. A pause, then what are they? Wade is ambitious and thorough, but ultimately still trying to solve one man's problem, his own. He built his network for defensive purposes, not offensive ones. And Pryor is a man who made a practical decision and wants to be left alone to live with it, not escalated into the kind of problem that ends careers. Everett was quiet for another moment. And if you're wrong about Pryor, then we have a larger problem than I thought, she said. But I'm not wrong about Pryor. The confidence in her own voice surprised even her. She had been confident about the ledgers that was her domain, that was 2 decades of learned expertise. This was character reading, which was a different kind of skill and one she had less formal training in. But she had grown up in her father's print shop where the workers came from every class and background, and she had spent her life in rooms where she had to understand the people in them accurately in order to navigate them safely. This was not a different skill. It was just applied to a different kind of record. Everett looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression had changed again, that quality she kept noticing and filing away, the look of a man recalibrating something against the reality of what he was experiencing. Your father, he said, the print shop. She blinked. What about it? What was it like? The question was so unexpected that she sat with it for a moment before answering. It was loud, she said, always smelling of ink and metal. Not clean. The workers were all kinds of people, different stories, different histories. My father knew every one of them and treated every one of them the same regardless. She paused. He used to say the press didn't care about your past. It cared about how you handled the work in front of you. That was his whole philosophy. A pause. He didn't last long in Pittsburgh's business community with that philosophy, but he lasted in his shop until the end. She'd looked at her hands. He died between one printing cycle and the next. I found him. She stopped. Everett was quiet. He had ink on his hands, she said. He always had ink on his hands. I used to tease him about it. She folded her hands together, feeling the particular phantom sensation of hands that weren't there. He would have liked this, she said finally. This work. Untangling the records. Building something accurate out of what had been falsified. A pause. He believed in accuracy the way some people believe in God, as a moral position. She stopped, suddenly aware that she had said more than she'd intended. Everett said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, he sounds like a man worth having known. The simplicity of it broke something small and tight in her chest. Yes, she said, he was. She stood up before she could say anything else she hadn't planned to say, gathered her notebook and went to the door. Nora, he said. She stopped. The Helena letter will come back with the right answer. And when it does, whatever Wade tries between now and then will hold. It was not comfort exactly. It was something more useful than comfort. It was certainty stated plainly by a man who was not given to false certainty, which meant the certainty was real. Yes, she said again, we will. She went to her room and lay in the dark and thought about her father and the print shop and the way the ledgers at Irongate had been before she'd rebuilt them, a kind of erasure of what had actually happened, an overwriting of the real record. She thought about how that was the thing she could not tolerate. Not the money, not the crime, the erasure. She was still thinking about it when she heard from somewhere south of the house the sound that changed everything. Fire. It was not a word she thought first. It was a smell, the particular sharpness of burning wood that was wrong for any hour of the night. And then through the window, the orange light that turned the dark into something pulsing and alive. She was out of bed and down the hall before she'd processed the full sequence. Everett was already in the yard. The east barn, the big one, the one that housed 6 of Irongate's best breeding horses, was alight on the south wall. Flames had found the dry wood and were moving fast already, 3 or 4 feet up the exterior planking and flickering through the gap where the wall met the eave. Jackson was there and 3 hands from the bunkhouse, and they were forming a bucket line from the trough. But the trough was 30 yards away, and the fire was moving faster than a bucket line could manage. And inside the barn, Nora could hear the horses. The horses, she said. We're working on it, Jackson said with the strained voice of a man doing several calculations at once. The south side stalls are already in danger, Nora said. She had been in that barn every day for 2 weeks, helping with morning feed, learning the routine. She knew the layout with the particular precision she gave to rooms she thought about carefully. The 6 horses in the breeding rotation were in the south side stalls. She soaked her shawl in the trough. Miss Vane, you cannot... She went in. The heat was a physical wall. She dropped immediately to a crouch. The worst smoke was at head height and moved toward the first stall on instinct and training, and the specific clarity that came from situations where thinking too much was the real danger. The first mare was rearing whites showing around her eyes. Nora got the latch, which was hot, but not yet unbearable, and the mare bolted past her toward the open door. 1. She moved to the second stall, staying low. The smoke was thicker now, the kind that wasn't just unpleasant, but was actively taking oxygen from the air. She could hear the fire eating the south wall with a sound like continuous tearing. Second mare out. She bolted after the first. 2. The third stall was harder. A burning beam had come down across the aisle, not blocking the stall door completely, but requiring her to step over it. The wood burned through her boot sole. She did not stop, got the latch, third mare out. 3. She turned for the fourth stall and stopped. Wade Cross stood at the smoke near the back of the barn. She wasn't hallucinating. She knew the difference between what she'd imagined and what she was actually seeing, and she was seeing Wade Cross standing 5 feet away from the fourth stall with his back to the burning south wall, watching her with the absolute stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see what happens next. You just couldn't let it go, he said. His voice was perfectly calm. Open the stalls, she said. The horses. I'll open them after you're not in a position to tell anyone what I'm doing here. His tone was rational, conversational. The tone of a man explaining a practical arrangement. It'll be a tragedy. Irongate's new wife died in a barn fire trying to save horses. Everyone will feel terrible. Everett will grieve. It'll be unfortunate. He paused. But the books go too, and the documentation. And whatever you sent to Helena, and in a month or two, when things have settled, the ranch will need someone to manage the financial operations again. I know these accounts better than anyone. The smoke pressed down. Nora's eyes were streaming. She had perhaps 2 minutes before the oxygen situation became critical. She looked at the man in front of her and felt something very cold move through her. You've done this before, she said. The poisoned cattle, the horses, the grain. You've been planning this for days. I've been managing this situation, Wade said. As I've been managing this ranch, the same thing someone with the skills has to. He took a step toward her. You're a remarkably capable woman in a limited situation. It's a shame. If I die in here, she said, thinking fast, Everett will know exactly what happened. There'll be an investigation, federal. The Helena letter. We'll get lost, he said, or arrive too late, or tell a different story than you think. He took another step. The territorial notary is 81 years old and lives with his son. Elderly men's memories are unreliable. Above them, a rafter cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The burning timber dropped. Nora threw herself sideways. The beam came down between her and Wade with a cascade of sparks and burning debris that scattered across both of them. She felt heat on her hands, her forearms. The back of her neck registered it distantly as pain to be examined later. She scrambled to the fourth stall, got the latch open. The mare bolted. 4. Through the smoke, she could see the fifth stall and beyond it the sixth. She moved toward them, not looking back at where Wade had been. Hands grabbed her from behind. Out, Everett's voice. Now. 2 more. Jackson is at the fifth. Out. He pulled her toward the door, and she couldn't fight it. The oxygen deficit was real now. Her body starting to prioritize with the blunt efficiency of physiology over intention. She let herself be pulled. They came out of the barn into cold air, and she folded immediately, coughing until her vision went white at the edges. Everett crouched beside her with both hands on her shoulders. 5 and 6, she managed. Both out. Jackson got them. He was checking her hands, her arms, the back of her neck. You're burned. Not badly. That's not your assessment to make right now. Wade is, she coughed again. Wade was in the barn. He was waiting for me. Everett went very still. She straightened, got her lungs working properly, and met his eyes. He said it would be a tragedy, that I'd die trying to save horses, that the books would go with me. She looked at her burned hands. He's not done. He's escalating. The east barn was mostly gone now. The hands had switched from fighting the fire to protecting the other structures, wetting down the adjacent grain storage, the nearby equipment shed. The barn was beyond saving. Jackson appeared out of the smoke. All 6 horses accounted for, no casualties. The sound of a horse moving fast, already receding into the dark beyond the fence line. There, Nora said. Everett turned, listened to the sound fading north. He's running, she said. He won't run far. Everett stood. The quality in his face was not the anger she might have expected, not hot and sudden, but cold and very long term. Jackson, get 4 men. Check the road into town and the north fence line. He paused. Tell them to bring him back. They brought Wade back at dawn. He had made it 8 miles toward the northern pass before Jackson and 3 hands found him in the gray pre-light, his horse tethered at a stream crossing, himself hunched over a fire that was too small to warm him and too obvious to hide him. He came back without incident. Whatever he'd decided during those 8 cold miles, it was not to fight 4 men who knew the terrain better than he did. The town had gathered by the time they arrived. Word spread fast in small territories, and a barn fire in the night was the kind of news that brought people out regardless of the hour. By the time Wade Cross was led through the gate of Iron Gate Ranch, there were perhaps 60 people in the yard, ranch hands, townspeople, curious faces Nora didn't recognize, and familiar ones she did. Loretta Shaw, her face stripped of its usual performance, watchful and calculating. The general store clerk, arms folded. 2 of the other men from choosing night standing in the back. Everett stood on the porch. Nora beside him, her hands bandaged with cloth. Harriet had provided her coat covering the worst of the burns on her forearms, her face composed in a way that she was not entirely sure she believed. You want to say something, Wade called from the yard, playing to the crowd, with the instinct of a man who had always been good at an audience. Fine, say it. Tell them all how I've been a thief and a forger and a saboteur. See what they make of it. I don't need to tell them anything, Everett said. I need to ask you one question. Wade was quiet. Why, Everett said. Not the money, not the land. Why? The silence stretched, and then something happened that Nora had not expected. Something she watched with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered and that she would think about later in the way she thought about ledger patterns, looking for what it revealed. Wade's face changed. Not the surface performance, not the warmth or the charm or the calculated emotion. Something underneath that something she thought might be the closest thing to genuine she had seen from him in 3 weeks. Because you gave me none of it, he said. 3 years managing this ranch. 3 years of being the person who kept this operation alive while you walked around in your grief like the world owed you the luxury of it. 3 years of being the one who made decisions, handled problems, kept Iron Gate running. And she, his eyes cut to Nora. 2 weeks, and suddenly she has authority I never had. Suddenly her word is your word. A woman you picked up at choosing night who was there because no one else wanted her. He stopped. I built what I built because this ranch was half mine by any practical measure. I just formalized it. The yard was very quiet. Nora looked at Wade Cross and felt something unexpected. Not sympathy, not at all, but the specific clarity of understanding a thing precisely. He had done terrible things for reasons that were in their core, the reasons people always did terrible things, the belief that what they'd built entitled them to more than they'd been given. Sheriff Pryor, Everett said. Pryor stepped forward from the back of the crowd, which told Nora her assessment had been correct. He had come when called rather than hiding, which was the behavior of a man who wanted to minimize exposure rather than compound it. There's enough here for arson, Everett said. An attempted murder if Miss Vane is willing to make a statement. I am, Nora said. Pryor looked at Wade Cross with the expression of a man who had made a calculating error and was accepting the consequences. Wade Cross turned, he said, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of arson and related offenses. We'll let the circuit judge sort out the rest. Wade looked at Nora one last time as Pryor produced the restraints. She held his gaze. She thought about 7 men in a hall who had looked at her and said no. She thought about her father's print shop and the belief in accuracy as a moral position. She thought about the notary seal pressed into heavy cream paper, the truth that outlasted all the attempts to overwrite it. It wasn't formalized, she said quietly. None of it was ever yours. They took him away. In the 3 days after the fire, Nora learned what it felt like when a town revised its opinion of you. It was not a simple thing. It was not the clean reversal she might have hoped for the collective recognition of error, followed by straightforward redemption. It was more complicated than that, more human, which was to say, it was gradual and uneven, and accompanied by the particular social discomfort of people who had said things they could not take back. Loretta Shaw came to Iron Gate on the second day. She came alone, which Nora noted. She did not bring her mother or a companion or any of the social armor that would signal a formal visit. She came in the mid-morning, tied her horse at the post, and knocked on the front door. Harriet brought her to the office. Loretta sat down at the visitor's chair across from Nora's desk, with the contained energy of a woman who had rehearsed this and was still not entirely comfortable with it. She looked at the bandaged hands, the carefully arranged documentation on the desk, the rebuilt ledger system organized in a way that was visibly different from what it had been. I owe you an apology, she said. Miss Shaw, Nora said. Let me finish. Loretta's chin came up slightly. I spread a specific version of a story that I had been told by someone I trusted, and I spread it publicly and without investigating it, and that was both unkind and foolish. I apologize for the unkind part. The foolish part I'll have to live with myself. Nora looked at her for a moment. Loretta Shaw was not, she thought, a bad person. She was a very intelligent person who lived in a community where her social position required her to process information quickly and align with the dominant narrative, and she had done exactly that. The story Wade told was designed to be convincing, Nora said. He is very good at what he does. That's gracious. It's accurate, Nora said. I don't believe in being gracious for its own sake. Loretta almost smiled. Then she said, how did you know? When you first arrived, how did you know something was wrong? Nora thought about the Anderson's feed invoice, the paper that was almost right but not quite. I'm a printer's daughter, she said. I know what good paper stock looks like. When an invoice is printed on paper that's close to the vendor's usual stock but not quite right, that tells me something. She paused. After that, it was just following the pattern. Just following the pattern, Loretta repeated. You say that like it's simple. It is simple, Nora said. It's not easy, but it is simple. Numbers don't lie. People lie, and numbers record the lie if you know how to read them. Loretta was quiet for a moment. In the hall that night, she said, you were in 7th position last. You stood through all of it. Yes. I watched you, Loretta said. I didn't want to. I had my own situation to manage. But I watched you, and I thought she's too small for this place. Too city. She'll be on the next stage back east. She paused. I've been wrong about a great many things, but that was a particular error. Nora folded her hands on the desk. You're not the only one who thought so. No, Loretta stood. Will you stay at Irongate? Yes, Nora said. Good. And with the decisive practicality of a woman who had completed the task she'd set herself and was moving on, Loretta Shaw took her leave. The circuit judge came through Sage Flats 11 days after the fire. He was a small, dry man named Justice Clement Harker, who had clearly heard every variation of frontier property dispute possible and had developed the specific fatigue of someone who had ceased to be surprised by human behavior while retaining the obligation to respond to it professionally. Wade Cross's case occupied 2 hours of the court's morning session. Nora gave her statement precisely without drama, with the documentation organized in the order that made the clearest argument. The forged deed was entered into evidence. The vendor fraud documentation was entered into evidence. The Montana rail correspondence was entered into evidence. Wade's territorial lawyer was competent, but visibly working against the weight of documentation that Nora had had 3 weeks to prepare and no one had been able to destroy. The verdict: guilty of arson, 1 count. Guilty of fraudulent financial management. The forgery charge was deferred to federal jurisdiction pending the Helena response. 7 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. Not as long as Nora had thought the evidence warranted, but 7 years was 7 years, and the federal forgery charge, when it came, would add to it. Wade Cross was led out of the Sage Flats courthouse without looking at anyone. Nora sat in the courtroom for a moment after everyone else had filed out. She looked at the judge's bench, the witness stand, the particular quality of afternoon light through the high windows that gave the room an official solemnity she found in the moment unexpectedly moving. Harriet found her there. It's done, Harriet said. The federal matter is still pending. The core is done. Harriet sat down beside her, which Nora would not have predicted on the morning of her first day at Irongate. My Thomas, the warrant from Ohio. If Wade had used it— He didn't, Nora said, because he lost before he could. A pause. If he'd managed things differently if you hadn't come— Mrs. Drummond? Nora turned to look at her. Harriet, you helped me. The Allgate letter, the transcription work. You helped me despite the risk. Harriet looked at her with those sharp, tired eyes. You were the only person in 3 years who came in here and started asking the right questions. I couldn't let that go to waste. You were brave, Nora said. I was tired, Harriet said. Tired of being silent. There's bravery in it, but there's also just the exhaustion of accommodation, and eventually you reach the end of what you can accommodate. She stood. Come home. Everett has been in the office all afternoon with the original survey documents, and I believe he's going to reorganize the entire filing system if you don't come stop him. Nora laughed, a short, surprised laugh that she hadn't expected. Harriet looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. There you are, she said. The reply from the U.S. General Land Office in Helena arrived 16 days after the fire. It confirmed what Nora had suspected and what the Billings notary had indicated: the deed modification submitted by Montana Rail Consortium was fraudulent. The seal used was a copy, imperfect, verifiable as inauthentic by forensic comparison with the 1879 original. The federal land surveyor assigned to the case would arrive in Sage Flats within the month to conduct a formal review. Montana Rail Consortium, faced with federal scrutiny of their acquisition practices, withdrew their easement claim within 3 days of receiving official notification. Irongate Ranch retained the full 12,000 acres, the Cutter's Ridge corridor, and every surveyed boundary that Margaret Cross had spent 6 months establishing in 1879. Nora read the federal reply twice, set it on the desk, sat for a moment. She thought about the 1879 survey document tucked behind the vaccination records, where no one had touched it in 3 years. She thought about the woman who had spent 6 months of correspondence and careful legal work to establish those boundaries, a woman she had never met, whose work she had spent 3 weeks protecting. She thought about what Everett had said on the first night in the wagon she kept the books. She was good at it. He knocked on the office door at the same time she'd been thinking of him, which was the kind of coincidence that felt less like coincidence and more like the ordinary rhythm of two people who had spent 6 weeks moving through the same space with increasing attunement to each other. It came, she said before he could speak. He came to the desk and read the letter. She watched his face, that face she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, the face that was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but had the specific quality of a landscape that revealed more the more time you spent in it. He read it twice as she had. Then he set the letter down carefully and sat in the second chair, and was quiet for a long moment. She would have been glad, he said. Not a question. Yes, Nora said. He looked at the survey document she had retrieved from behind the vaccination records and placed in the center of the desk a week ago, the 1879 original, the real one, the one with the legitimate notary seal pressed into heavy cream paper. She used to say that land records were the honest version of the ranch's story, he said, that the ledgers could be adjusted, the accounts could be interpreted, but the survey records were just what was true. He looked at the document. That's why she spent 6 months on them. Nora thought about her father and accuracy as a moral position. She wasn't wrong, she said. Everett looked at her. They sat in the office for a moment in a silence that was different from the silences she'd cataloged over the past 6 weeks. Not the silence of two strangers managing proximity, not the silence of a practical arrangement avoiding unnecessary conversation. Something else, the silence of two people who had been through something and had come out the other side and were sitting in the particular light of having survived it, examining what else was there. I need to tell you something, Everett said. She waited. When I sent inquiries about you before choosing night, he paused in the way that meant he was being precise. I told you I needed someone who would ask the right questions, someone with authority in the house. Those things were true. But not complete, she said. Not complete. He looked at the survey document again. I had known for 6 weeks that the accounts were being manipulated. I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't fix it alone, and I was unwilling to bring someone in without authority because Wade would have removed them before they found anything significant. A pause. When I heard you'd come to Sage Flats and were looking for work, that you had the specific kind of accounting background, the situation required I made inquiries. And what I found confirmed what I needed. Nora felt the particular quality of a thing that had been hovering in the periphery of her understanding for weeks, crystallizing into clarity. You chose me deliberately, she said, not just for a wife, for this, for the investigation specifically. Yes. The word fell into the silence between them. She sat with it. She thought about it with the same care she gave a complex ledger, not reaching for the emotion first, but examining the structure of the thing to make sure she understood it accurately. You used choosing night because it gave me authority in the house, she said. Because you needed someone who could access the records and confront Wade without him being able to simply fire them and remove the evidence. Yes. And the things you said on the road that first night about needing a partner, about seeing who I was before you chose me, those things, were also true. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, not defensiveness, not apology, something that might have been its own kind of honesty. I don't say things I don't mean. The observation about your work, about what I saw during choosing night, that was true. But it wasn't the reason. It was part of the reason. A pause. I told you the arrangement was calculated. I told you that on the first night. I did not deceive you about that. Nora thought about the first night. The dark road, the stars that went on forever. He had said, I'm not trying to replace her. She had said, I'm not looking for a replacement. They had agreed we understand each other. They had understood each other to the extent that both of them knew it was a calculated arrangement. She had simply not known exactly what was being calculated. How much of it, she said, was the investigation, and how much was the rest? The silence this time was the longest one she had waded through. I went to choosing night ready to make a practical decision, he said. I had identified you as the right person for the problem I needed solved. I came with a plan, a clear-eyed, calculated plan. He paused. And then I watched you in that hall for 2 hours before I stood up. I watched you receive 6 rejections and stand through every one of them without changing your posture, without looking at the door, without performing grief or humility for the crowd. You just kept being yourself, exactly the same at the end as at the beginning. He looked at her. The plan was still the plan, he said, but it wasn't only that anymore. Nora turned this over. She was 26 years old, and she had spent most of those years in rooms where she had to understand what was actually happening, regardless of what was being said. She had been rejected 7 times in a public hall. She had come west with $12 and her father's ledger and a dying mother, and the bone-deep conviction that accuracy was worth something. She looked at Everett Cross, this man she had been married to for 6 weeks, this stranger who was not a stranger, this man who had seen her doing her job and decided she was worth knowing more carefully, and she asked herself the question she'd been asking the whole time she was in this house. What is actually true here? What was true was this: he had come to choosing night for a reason, and the reason was real and it served his interests. He had also seen something genuine in her, and that was real too. He had not lied to her. He had told her the arrangement was calculated, and he had told her exactly what he was calculating. What he had not told her was the specific shape of the calculation. She thought about her father, who always said a ledger that's mostly accurate is still a ledger with errors in it. She said, I would have done it anyway. He looked at her. If you'd told me on the first night on the road that you had a specific problem with a specific man who had been stealing from you for 3 years and forging your land documents, and that you needed someone with accounting skills and authority to come in and document it and help you stop it, I would have agreed. She held his gaze. Maybe not to marriage, but to the work, to the purpose, because it was the right thing and I was qualified for it, and your ranch was being destroyed. A pause. You didn't need to withhold the specifics to get my help. He was quiet. You withheld them, she said, because you weren't sure. About me, about whether I could be trusted with the full picture before you'd seen me work. She thought about it, which, given what you'd been through with Wade, is an understandable calculation. Yes, he said. I am angry about it, she said. I want to be honest about that. Not because you were wrong to be cautious, but because I've spent 6 weeks operating with less information than I would have liked, and that bothers me. She paused. But I also understand why you made the decision you made. He was watching her with that quality of attention she had come to associate with him, processing something that mattered. I'm sorry, he said. I should have told you sooner. It was the first time he had apologized to her. She received it with the same care she would give to an unexpected line item in an account, something that changed the total and needed to be properly recorded. Yes, she said, you should have. A pause. We're going to have to work on that, she said. Something moved in his expression, that involuntary quality, the quality that was closest to what she thought of as his genuine face. On what, he said. On you trusting me with the full picture. She folded her bandaged hands on the desk. We managed this particular problem, and I managed it without the complete information. But if we're going to do this properly, if we're going to build Iron Gate the way it should be built, I need to know what I'm actually working with. All of it. All of it, he repeated. Everything. The accounts, yes, but also the rest, the history, the land, whatever is in those files I haven't read yet. She met his eyes. And whatever is not in any file. He understood what she meant. That takes time, he said. I know. She did not look away. I'm not going anywhere. The silence this time was different again. Not any of the varieties she'd cataloged, but something new. Something that felt like the space between the last number in a column and the total being written. The sum not yet stated, but already known by everything that preceded it. No, he said, you're not. The Helena surveyor arrived 3 weeks later and completed the formal review in 4 days. The Iron Gate survey boundaries were confirmed in the federal record. The fraudulent deed modification was officially voided. Montana Rail Consortium's easement claim was dead. Nora was present at the federal review, not as a bystander, but as the property manager of record, because in the weeks since the fire, Everett had signed documentation that formalized her role in exactly the terms she'd said were needed. Not an assistant, not a household manager. A co-signatory on the financial accounts, a listed manager of ranch operations in writing with the kind of legal standing that would make the next Wade Cross, if there ever was one, understand from the beginning what they were dealing with. The surveyor, a precise man named Aldous Green, who had clearly been to a great many territorial properties and had his own methodology for evaluating things, asked her several questions about the accounting process she'd used to identify the fraud. She answered them precisely with documentation. He wrote things in his notebook with the particular quality of a man who was making notes that would last. You've done good work here, he said when the review was complete. It was a professional statement. She took it as a professional statement, but she also held it in her chest for a moment before she responded, because she had been told she brought nothing and had nothing to offer. And the land below her feet was testament to the falsenesses of that. She had brought exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. And the documents now in the federal record were partly the product of her father's gift to her, the belief that accuracy was worth fighting for. Thank you, she said. 3 months after chilly night on a cold November evening, With the first of winter settling across the Sage Flats range, Nora sat at the desk in the office and wrote a letter to her mother. She had been writing regularly, weekly, since the Helena confirmation, sending money with each letter. The treatment was working. The last letter from Pittsburgh had been cautiously hopeful. The doctor has encouraged the symptoms have lessened by spring. She might be well enough to consider travel. This letter was different. Dear Mother, she wrote, I want to tell you about the place where I live. She wrote about the range in morning light, the particular gold gray of Sage Flats before the sun reached full height, the way the mountains to the north were beginning to show their winter character. She wrote about the horse operation and the ranch hands and Harriet Drummond, who had become something she could not quite call a friend yet, but was moving in that direction with the deliberate pace of a woman who did not extend friendship carelessly, but meant it absolutely when she did. She wrote, I married a man you would find difficult to read, and that is the best recommendation I know. He is precise and careful and trusts slowly, and when he trusts you, it is not a performance, but a real thing, the kind that is worth having. I am learning him at the rate he allows, which is the right rate. She paused, looking at the survey document that now had a proper place in the filing system, the 1879 original, the one with the notary seal in the land records section of the upper cabinet where it belonged. Next to it, the federal confirmation. Next to that, the clean quarterly accounts for Iron Gate Ranch first quarter, documented under her management. She wrote, I have been in this place for 3 months. I have done work that matters. I have helped protect something that was worth protecting, and in doing so have found, this is harder to say clearly, have found that the things those men at choosing night said about me were a record of their own limitations, not mine. I carried those words like they were accurate. They were not. I know what I'm worth now. Not in the way of land and connections and family names, I will never have those, in the way they meant, but in the way that counts, which is the work I can do, and the problems I can solve, and the particular quality of attention I bring to the question of what is actually true. 7 men said no. 1 man said yes for reasons that were in part calculated and in part something he is still working out how to say. I said yes for reasons that were entirely practical and are becoming with time something more complicated than that which I am examining with the same care I bring to everything. The light through this window was fading. November dark came early here, faster than Pittsburgh, dropping over the range like something deliberate. She heard him in the hallway, that particular quality of footstep she had catalogued weeks ago, the weight and pace of a man who moved with purpose but never urgency. He knocked. Come in, she said. He came in and looked at the letter on the desk, not reading it, just noting its presence with the awareness he brought to everything in his household, and sat in the second chair. The Briggs fence line will need review before spring, he said. There's a section in the north quarter that didn't hold last winter. I'll add it to the maintenance ledger, she said. The supply contracts need renewal in January. I know. I've been preparing the renewal documentation. I thought you might have been. He looked at the survey document in the cabinet. Then he looked at her. You're writing to your mother. Yes. Tell her the spring invitation still stands. She looked at him. It was the first time he had mentioned it explicitly, the idea of her mother visiting, the idea of the kind of permanence that involved inviting family west. I already have, she said. He nodded. The amber eyes settled on her face with that quality of attention she had spent 3 months learning and had still not fully decoded the attention that was its own language and required time she was glad she had. It's good work you're doing, he said. Meaning the renewal contracts, meaning the books, meaning she thought all of it. I know, she said. So is yours. The simplicity of it, mutual recognition between 2 people who had come to this arrangement by separate calculations and were finding with careful time that the arrangement had become something worth the complications it had cost them, sat in the room between them like a completed ledger. Accurate, total. Harriet Drummond had been at Iron Gate Ranch since 1874, which was 8 years before Nora arrived, and which meant she had been present for almost everything. She had been present when Everett Cross brought his new wife Margaret to the ranch for the first time. She had watched Margaret walk through the house with the quiet assessment of a woman who was deciding what needed changing and in what order, and she had thought, this one will do. She had been right. She had been present when Margaret Cross died in the summer of 1876. The fever that came on fast and did not recede, the 3 days of controlled crisis, the morning when the crisis had been decided by forces that did not negotiate. She had watched Everett come back from the bedroom and stand in the kitchen doorway with the specific quality of a man who has arrived in a country he has no map for and she had thought of her own Thomas gone 2 years by then, and had understood something that she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She had been present when Wade Cross arrived 6 months after Margaret's death, with the easy warmth that was one of his genuinely real qualities, and the management capacity that was also genuinely real, and she had thought this could work. She had also thought with the specific instinct she had never fully trusted, because trusting her instincts had not always served her. There is something here that will need watching. She had not watched carefully enough. She had watched carefully enough to see the pattern building, the small choices that accumulated, the convenient opacity in the accounts that Wade always had a ready explanation for the way he positioned himself between Everett and any external perspective on the financial operations. She had seen it, and she had been silent, and the silence had been purchased by Thomas's name in Wade's mouth. And she had told herself that Everett would figure it out eventually, that someone else would come, that it would resolve. Nora had come. Harriet Drummond, who was not given to dramatic self-assessment, had sat in the kitchen on the morning after choosing night and looked at this city woman in her pressed navy dress and her single worn case and her steady, uncalibrated eyes, and thought something is about to change. She had not helped Nora immediately. She had been cautious. She was always cautious, now the kind of caution that came from being silenced for 2 years by a man you couldn't confront. But she had told Nora to read the office records. She had left that door open, which was not nothing. And then Nora had come to her with the specific question, "He has something over you," stated plainly and without cruelty. The question of someone who was building a picture and needed the accurate piece, and Harriet had told the truth about Thomas. She had told the truth about Thomas and waited for it to feel terrible. It had not felt terrible. It had felt like setting down something she had been carrying for 2 years in the wrong direction. Not dropping it, not abandoning it, but orienting it correctly. Thomas had done what he'd done and paid for it and lived a good life and died in it a good man. And that truth did not need to be hidden from Nora, who was asking about it in the service of accuracy rather than judgment. Nora had said, "I'm not going to use this. I need to understand the full picture." She had understood what that meant. It meant your truth is part of the record, and accurate records are the point, but the point is Irongate's future, not your past. She had transcribed the railroad correspondence by lamplight at her small kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, her handwriting careful and steady, and she had felt for the first time in 2 years that she was actively doing something rather than enduring something. After the arrest, after the federal ruling, after the employment program, and the vote that ended choosing night, Harriet observed a particular change in Irongate that she would have found it difficult to articulate precisely, but that she understood in her bones. It was not simply that the ranch was running well. It had run well under Margaret, and it had run adequately under Wade, and it ran well under Nora, but well was not the distinction. The distinction was the quality of honesty in the house. Under Wade, Harriet had learned to manage information, to calibrate what she said based on what he might use. This was not lying exactly, but it was the constant effort of never letting your guard fully down, never speaking freely about things that mattered, never being certain who in the household was operating on the same understanding. Under Nora, she found herself saying what she thought. This seemed like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was the difference between a house that was a place to manage and a house that was a place to inhabit. And Harriet, who had been a teacher in Boston before everything changed, and who still sometimes thought of the classrooms where she had taught students to read critically and write clearly, understood something about the value of an environment where accurate speech was the standard. She also, being Harriet, said none of this directly, but she made the south-facing room as comfortable as possible for Elspeth Vane, and she taught June Alcott's daughter to identify 4 edible plants in the south pasture, and she took on the chicken house management after the rebuilt hen house was finished in November, with a degree of personal investment that was about more than chickens. And once, just once, in a brief late evening conversation in the kitchen in January, when Nora came in for a cup of tea before bed and found Harriet still there finishing the day's pantry inventory, she said to Nora without preamble and without ceremony, "I should have acted sooner on what I knew about Wade." Nora looked at her. "You acted when the conditions allowed you to act." The conditions were fear. Fear is a condition, Nora said. It's not an excuse, but it's a real thing, and it changes what's possible. You told me when you could tell me. That was enough. Harriet was quiet for a moment. "Your father," she said, "the printer." "Yes, you carry him with you." Nora considered this. I carry what he taught me, she said, which is not quite the same thing, though it feels like it sometimes. Harriet looked at this neat stack of pantry inventory she'd been working through. Numbers in columns accurate and precise, the daily maintenance of a functioning household. He would be proud, she said. I know, Nora said. I act as if that's true anyway. It helps. It was the most unguarded thing Harriet had heard her say, and she filed it away carefully not to use, but because it mattered, because these were the pieces of a person that you needed to see to understand them fully, and understanding Nora Cross fully had become, over the past months, something Harriet found she genuinely wanted. She was not sure exactly when the relationship had shifted from professional assessment to something she would call, if she were being accurate, care. But she knew the shift had happened. And she thought, because she was Harriet, because she believed in examining things honestly, that the shift had happened on the morning of the barn fire, when she had watched this small city woman, with her bandaged hands and her steady voice, count for what had happened in that burning building and say about 6 horses she had known for less than a month they needed help. As if it were obvious. As if the obvious thing for someone who saw what needed doing and did it was exactly that. The federal forgery hearing was scheduled for March in Billings. Nora had known it was coming, had been tracking the correspondence since October, maintaining the documentation dossier with the same methodical attention she brought to the quarterly accounts. She had not, however, expected the particular complication that arrived 6 weeks before the hearing in the form of a letter from the law offices of Whitfield and Penn, representing the Montana Rail Consortium. She read it twice. Then she went to find Everett. He was in the north pasture reviewing the winter herd, which she had learned over 5 months was where he went when the day required something purely physical, the particular clarity that came from doing work that was honest about what it was. She rode out and found him on horseback at the edge of the herd, talking to Jackson about a steer that was showing early signs of respiratory illness. She waited until Jackson had gone, then handed him the letter. He read it, in the cold November air, his horse standing patient and still beside him. They're claiming the easement modification was valid, he said. Their lawyer says they have a signed deed modification from 1880, not the 1882 one we've been working from, an earlier document. She watched his face. A 1880 document would predate the forgery charge timeline by 2 years. If it's legitimate, it would change the federal case significantly. Everett was quiet. I don't believe it's legitimate, Nora said, but I believe it exists, and I believe we need to find out what it is before March. You've seen it. No, their lawyer is citing it as evidence to be presented at the hearing. But they've described it a deed modification for the Cutter's Ridge corridor, signed by the owner of a record notarized on October 17, 1880. She paused. Everett, do you remember October of 1880? She watched his face carefully as she asked. He went still in the way that had nothing to do with calm, the stillness of a man who has been asked a question that reaches somewhere he doesn't go easily. Patrick Greer died in October of 1880, he said. He was my partner in the original Iron Gate land purchase. We'd been friends since before the ranch. He died of a lung infection. He paused. I was not myself for some time after. How long? Weeks. Several weeks. He looked at the letter. There were documents. People came with documents. Legal matters related to Patrick's share of the property that needed resolution. Nora felt the cold settle more fully. Is it possible, she said carefully, that in that period you signed something you did not fully understand, something that was presented as one thing and was actually another? The question sat between them in the winter air. Wade would have been handling the business correspondence at that time, Everett said. Yes, she said, he would. A long silence. He planned ahead, Everett said. He didn't just start the railroad scheme when Montana Rail approached him. He laid the groundwork 2 years in advance. I think so, Nora said. I think when Patrick died and when you were not well, he saw an opportunity and he used it. He had a document prepared and he got your signature on it during a period when you were not fully present, and he kept it for years as insurance. Everett's jaw was tight. She watched him absorb this, the specific quality of absorbing the information that someone you trusted had been watching you grieve and calculating what to do with your vulnerability. Can you beat it? He said. I don't know yet. She was honest because honesty was what they had built. Their lawyer will argue that the 1880 document is valid because it was signed and notarized. Our argument would have to be that you were not in a legal capacity to enter into a contract at the time of signing. She paused. That's a harder argument than forgery. It requires evidence of my state of mind in October of 1880. he said flatly. Yes. Who was here? Harriet, Jackson, anyone who was at Irongate during that period. A pause. And James Aldridge, if he remembers, the Billings notary. If he notarized the 1880 document, he'd be required to testify about the circumstances. He's 81. He's still alive, Nora said, and he is clearly a man who takes his professional responsibilities seriously. He verified the 1879 seal when I asked accurately and promptly. If he notarized a document for a man who was visibly incapacitated by grief, I believe he will say so. Everett looked at her. I need to go to Billings before the hearing, she said. I need to speak to Aldridge directly. And I need to review every document from the weeks after Patrick Greer's death, every supply order, every correspondence, everything in the records from October through December of 1880. Because if you were signing things mechanically during that period, the records will show a different character in those months than the months before and after. Different how? The kind of care you apply to documents when you're fully present, it leaves traces. Precision in the dates, consistency in the phrasing, attention to detail. When someone is going through the motions, she paused. The ledgers from that period are in the cabinet. Margaret's handwriting stops in July of 1876, but the operational records continue. I'll need to look at them. He looked at her for a long moment. You're going to prove that I was not myself. I'm going to prove that you were persuaded to sign something you would never have signed under ordinary circumstances, she said. That's not a weakness. It's evidence of what was done to you. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, when do you need to leave for Billings? 2 weeks, to allow time for the research and the journey and the interview with Aldridge. I'll arrange the travel. I'd rather go alone. He looked at her. Not because I don't want your presence, she said. Because if you come, the conversation with Aldridge becomes about you and his memory of you, which is personal and potentially uncomfortable. If I come alone as Irongate's property manager, conducting a professional review of historical records, it stays in the domain I'm strongest in. She paused. I know what I'm doing in that domain. He held her gaze. I know you do. Then trust it. Another pause, the kind that she had learned over 5 months to read as him, deciding whether to hold his position or update it. He updated it. 2 weeks, he said. She spent those 2 weeks in the records. The October through December 1880 period revealed what she had suspected. The documents from those months were different, not in content, nothing that would be obvious to a casual reviewer, but in the quality of engagement. Everett's notations in the margins of supply orders were shorter, fewer. The careful double annotations he applied in good months, cross-referencing cattle tallies, checking vendor prices against prior quarters, were absent. The letters sent from Irongate during that period were brief, where they were usually methodical, missing the particular precision she'd come to associate with him. The records of a man who was technically functioning and not himself. She documented all of it with the care she'd given to the vendor fraud 3 months ago, not for drama, but because accuracy was the point, because the records contained the truth if you knew how to look. She also found in his correspondence files from November 1880 a letter from Everett Cross to a law firm in Billings. It had been filed in the wrong folder, she believed deliberately backfiled into Patrick Greer's partnership dissolution correspondence, where no one would think to look for it. It was an inquiry about the legal process for formalizing a property easement through a proxy signatory. Dated 3 weeks after Patrick Greer's death. She copied the letter carefully, word for word, in her notebook. Then she put it back. Billings in February was cold with the specific commitment of a place that had decided on cold and was not going to revisit the decision. James Aldridge lived in a 2-room house on the north side of the city, with his son's family occupying a chair by a fire that appeared to be maintained at considerable expense. He was 81 as advertised, and his body had reduced itself to the essential core of a man, but his eyes when they found Nora across the room were clear and had the particular quality of attention she had come to associate with people who had spent their professional lives in the service of official accuracy. Mrs. Cross, he said, Irongate Ranch. Yes, sir. She sat in the chair his son's wife had provided. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I verified your seal inquiry in October, he said. When I received the federal case notification and understood what it was about, I expected someone from Irongate would eventually come. She blinked. You expected us. I notarized 3 documents for Irongate Ranch in the relevant period, he said. The 1879 survey contract, which your inquiry concerned and which is straightforward. And two others. He paused. The second is what you've come about. The 1880 easement modification. Yes. His hands, which she noted were steady despite his age, folded in his lap. I notarized that document on October 17th, 1880. I did my duty. I confirmed the identity of the signing party. I witnessed the signature. I applied my seal. He looked at her steadily. I have spent 4 years uncomfortable with it. Why, she said. Because the man who signed it was not. He paused. In my 40 years of practice, I have notarized thousands of documents. You develop a sense for whether a person is present, whether they understand what they're signing. He stopped again. He signed it, technically. His hand made the right marks on the right line, but the person behind the signing was not there. He had the look of a man in a room with no walls. He met her eyes. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, she said, I do. The man who presented the document, not the owner. A younger man, well-dressed, he moved things along quickly. Said they were concluding a business matter related to a recent death in the partnership. Said the timing was important. Aldridge's voice carried the specific weight of a man who had been carrying something a long time. I told myself it was grief. That grief was not incapacity. That if the man was present and could sign, my duty was done. Mr. Aldridge, Nora said gently, you were not wrong to seal it. Your duty was what you understood it to be. The wrong was done by the man who presented the document under those circumstances, knowing what condition the signer was in. He looked at her. I'm asking you to tell the truth at the hearing, she said. Not about whether your notarization was proper. It was under the standards that apply to you. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you observed. The condition of the signing party, the behavior of the presenting party, what you saw. A long silence. Yes, he said, I'll tell the truth. The federal hearing in Billings was conducted in a federal court building that smelled of new timber and bureaucratic purpose. The judge was a woman, which surprised several people in the room and surprised Nora not at all. Her name was Federal Land Court Judge Aurelie Fontaine, and she had the quality of a person who had sat in many rooms where people tried to get away with things and had developed an absolute precision about what constituted evidence. Montana Rail's lawyer was a man from Helena named Tyndall, and he was good. He presented the 1880 document with the confidence of a man who believed the paper would hold. He argued that Iron Gate Ranch's owner had signed a legal easement modification properly notarized, and that the subsequent federal land office dispute was an attempt by the current property management, meaning Nora, to reverse a valid prior agreement. He did not say 7 men rejected her at a choosing night, but he came close in implications, suggesting that the recent marriage arrangement at Iron Gate had introduced a management perspective that was at best unfamiliar with the property's full legal history. Nora sat at the respondents' table and listened with complete composure and thought 3 more exhibits. She presented her case in order. First, the financial records analysis covering the period, October through December 1880, showing the documented change in the quality of the owner's engagement, the shorter annotations, the absent cross-checks, the letters from Billings that had been filed in the wrong place for 4 years, Wade Cross's November inquiry to a law firm about proxy signatories. Second, testimony from Harriet Drummond, who had been at Iron Gate in October 1880 and testified with the clip and precision of a woman who had been waiting 4 years to say something in an official capacity about what she had witnessed, that Everett Cross had not slept in 3 weeks after Patrick Greer's death, had not eaten reliably, had been managed through basic operational decisions by the ranch staff, and had signed documents when they were placed in front of him without demonstrating any apparent awareness of their contents. Third, James Aldridge. He came in on his son's arm and sat in the witness chair with the deliberate care of an 81-year-old man who had decided this was worth the journey. He told the court precisely what he had told Nora in his chair by the fire, that he had notarized the document, that his process had been technically correct, and that the man who signed had not been present in the way a man entering a legal agreement needed to be present. Tyndall cross-examined with skill. He pressed on the standards of notarization, on the question of whether grief constituted legal incapacity, on whether Aldridge's impression was professional observation or retrospective projection. Aldridge looked at him with 81 years of having applied his professional seal to official truth and said, Young man, I have notarized documents for 40 years. I know what presence looks like. What I saw that day was its absence. The court was quiet. Then Judge Fontaine said, Miss Vane, Mrs. Cross, you have one more exhibit, I believe. Nora set the final document on the table. It was not as Tyndall had visibly anticipated another accounting exhibit. It was a single page of Everett Cross's operational correspondence from September 1881. Month before the signing, 6 weeks before Patrick Greer's death, the last month of normal function before the documented change. It was a letter to a supply vendor that was careful, methodical, detailed, annotated in 4 different places, and signed with the specific attention of a man who meant every word. Then she placed beside it a letter from December 1882, months after the signing, showing the same man beginning to return to himself, the annotations coming back the precision, reasserting. And she placed beside both of them a full comparative analysis, every operational document from September 1879 and through March 1881, with the period from October through November 1880, clearly differentiated in documentary character from every month before and after. The change is not grief, she said. Grief is a human condition that does not eliminate legal capacity. This, she touched, the comparative chart, is incapacitation. A man going through the motions of his work while not present to what those motions meant. The person who presented a document for his signature on October 17th, 1880, knew exactly what condition he was in because that person had been watching him closely for weeks, managing his affairs with increasing autonomy, and had written to a law firm in the 3rd week of November to inquire about the legal weight of signatures obtained under such circumstances. She looked at the judge. The document is not a forgery. It is something potentially worse, the legal exploitation of a man at his most vulnerable by someone who had spent years building toward exactly this moment. Judge Fontaine looked at the document comparison for a long moment. Then she looked at Tyndall. Your client's easement claim, she said, rests on a document obtained under circumstances that this court finds on the evidence presented to constitute undue influence and constructive incapacity. The valid land record for Iron Gate Ranch is the 1879 survey confirmed by the Federal Land Office review of last November. The 1880 modification is hereby voided. She paused. Additionally, she said, I'm directing a review of Montana Rail Consortium's acquisition practices in this territory over the past 5 years based on the pattern of behavior demonstrated in this case. She closed the folder in front of her with the definitive sound of something concluded. Court is adjourned. She stood outside this courthouse in Billings with Harriet and old James Aldridge in the cold March air and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph. That was too loud for what this was. It was more like the feeling after finishing a very large, very complex calculation and finding that the total was right. The specific satisfaction of accuracy achieved at the cost of significant effort. The quiet of a thing done properly. You did it, Harriet said. We did it, Nora said. You testified. Mr. Aldridge testified. She looked at the old notary who was standing in the cold air with the particular dignity of a man who has finally said what he should have said years ago. Thank you, she said, for telling the truth. It's my job, he said simply. Yes, she said, it is. She rode back to Iron Gate in the 2nd week of March when the first suggestions of a Montana spring were appearing in the color of the grass and the quality of the light. Everett was waiting at the gate. This was not, she thought later, something she should have been surprised by. He was a man who met things directly. She had learned this about him over 8 months, that whatever the social costs of directness, he found the alternative more costly. She understood this because she was the same. He took the horse from her and handed the reins to Tom and walked with her toward the house without speaking until they were inside. The ruling came by telegraph, he said. I know, I sent it yesterday. Voided, he said, completely. Yes. He stopped in the hallway of the house he had built and she had come to without plan or safety net and had spent 8 months making in her own way her own. He stopped and looked at her in the way she had cataloged across those 8 months, the amber eyes, the quality of attention, the face that was not a performance. Thank you, he said. It was the same phrase she'd used to Aldridge. Simple, accurate, the right weight. The land was yours, she said. Margaret's work, the boundaries she established, they deserved to be protected. I was glad to do it. That's not only what I'm thanking you for. She waited. I haven't, he stopped, started again with the deliberate care she knew now as the particular effort he put into saying things he meant precisely. I haven't been good at this, at explaining things, at trusting fully before I had evidence, at letting someone in before I was certain. He looked at her. You've been patient with a process that was slower than it should have been. You had reasons, she said. I had reasons. I also had habits built from years of managing loss by managing distance. He paused. You told me in November that we needed to work on trusting you with the full picture. I've been working on it. She looked at him. I've noticed. He had been different since November. Not dramatically, not in the way she would have expected from someone making a deliberate effort at change, which often looked like performance. The change in Everett was more like the change in the ledgers after she'd rebuilt them. The same structure, the same underlying principles, but with the errors corrected and the actual numbers visible. He said things he was less certain of. He told her more about the history of the ranch, about Patrick Greer, about Margaret, not all of it, not yet, but in the increments of a man who was learning to trust the person he was trusting rather than maintaining the habit of solitude. She had not pressed. She had learned the right rate. There's something I want to show you, he said. He led her to the east side of the property, past the rebuilt barn, past the new fence lines that had gone up over the winter to the edge of the Cutter's Ridge corridor. The land opened out there in the way that land in this territory did, suddenly and abundantly, a long view east that caught the particular quality of March light in a way she had never seen in Pennsylvania. He stood at the edge of the ridge and looked out. Margaret stood here the week the survey was finalized, he said. She said this was what she'd been working for, not the legal document, the view. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't come out here since she died. Nora stood beside him and looked at the view. It was a good view, not pretty in the way of decoration, but in the way of the genuine, the particular beauty of a place that meant something, that had been defended and recorded and kept. She would have been glad, Everett said, that it was someone like you who kept it. She thought about the 7 rejections. She thought about 7 men who had looked at her and found her wanting no land, no connections, no advantage. She thought about the one man who had stood up from his chair at the back of the hall and crossed the room with the conviction of someone who had already made the only calculation that mattered. She thought about the ledger from her father's shop, which was still in her case, still in her room, his handwriting in the columns, the precision of a man who believed in accuracy as a form of love for the truth. I'm glad it was me too, she said. They stood on the ridge in the March light and looked at the Cutter's Ridge corridor and the land that had been fought for and saved and was now part of the federal record, permanent, accurate, true. Then Everett said, your mother arrives in April. Yes, I've had a room prepared on the ground floor. Harriet has been, she and I had several conversations about it. The room has a south window, good light all day. Nora turned to look at him. He was looking at the view, not at her, in the manner of a man who was saying something significant and preferred the cover of apparent inattention. You discussed my mother's visit with Harriet, she said. We discussed what would be needed, a pause, at some length. How long? 2 weeks, possibly 3. The corner of his mouth moved. Harriet has opinions about south-facing rooms and their role in recovery. Nora laughed. The same surprised, involuntary laugh he had once produced from her at the dinner table in November, and his expression was the same, that quality of being caught off guard by something that genuinely pleased him. You talked to Harriet for 3 weeks about my mother's room, she said, and about the wagon access from the main road, he said, and the proximity to the kitchen and whether the kitchen hours would need adjustment for dietary considerations. He looked at her finally with the amber eyes that were warmest when they were being their most direct. She's your mother. She needs to be comfortable here. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fact that 8 months ago she had stood in a hall and been rejected by 7 men who listed what she lacked. She thought about this man who had not listed what she lacked, but had looked at what she was. She thought about the ledger in her case and her father's ink-stained hands and accuracy as a form of love. Everett, she said. Yes, I'm not patient by nature, she said. I want you to know that. What you've called my patience is actually just recognition that some things take the time they take and can't be rushed without damaging them. She held his gaze. I've been working at the right rate, but I know what the total is at this point, and I think you do too. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said, I do. She stepped toward him because she had spent 8 months learning to read his language, and she knew the moment when something that had been building needed to stop being careful and simply be. He met her in it. It was not dramatic. It was not the declaration of a man who had been practiced at demonstrations. It was the specific quality of two people who had spent 8 months learning each other with more care than they had perhaps ever learned another person arriving at the thing that had been taking its time. When they stepped apart, the view was still there, the long east corridor, the March light, the land that had been defended and was now properly held. "Come on," he said. "The supply renewal contracts still need review before the end of the week." "I know," she said. "I've been tracking them." He almost smiled. "I know you have." They walked back through the corridor together, through the rebuilt barn, past the new fence lines, toward the house on the hill where the east window of her office caught the afternoon light in a way she had come to think of as hers. Her mother arrived in April on a Tuesday in the second week of spring, when the Sage Flats were doing the thing they did in April, which was to say, becoming something other than gray and flat, becoming the particular varied green gold of a landscape that had been dormant and was now with the specific commitment of a place that meant things coming back. She stepped off the wagon from the billing stage with the look of a woman who had spent 3 days traveling and found every mile of it worthwhile. Elspeth Vane was 61 and she was still unwell in the specific way of someone who had been very ill and was winning a slow war back. But she was also, Nora recognized this immediately, with a quality of relief she had been storing for 8 months. She was also herself. The sharp eyes, the upright posture, the way she looked at Iron Gate Ranch with the assessment of a woman who had sent her daughter west to a stranger and was determining whether the stranger had been a good decision. She looked at the ranch. She looked at Harriet, who was standing on the porch with the specific contained welcome of a woman who had prepared a south-facing room for 3 weeks and considered it a professional matter. She looked at Everett Cross, who stood at the foot of the porch steps, with the quality of a man meeting his wife's mother for the first time and applying to it the same methodical attention he applied to everything. Then she looked at Nora. "Well," she said. "Well," Nora said. Her mother walked forward and took her face in both hands and looked at her, the long, specific look of a parent who is checking whether the person in front of them is the same person they sent away or someone new. "You look different," she said. "I am different," Nora said. "Good different." "Yes," Nora said, "I think so." Her mother released her, turned to Everett with the directness that was apparently genetic in the Vane family and said, "You chose her after 7 men said no." "Yes," Everett said. "Were you wise or lucky?" Everett looked at Nora. Something moved in his expression, that quality she had been cataloging for 8 months, that quality of being genuinely present. "Both," he said. Elspeth Vane looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the south-facing window of the prepared room and the wide porch of the house on the hill and the long sweep of the Sage Flats range going gold in the April light. "Both is honest," she said. "I can work with honest." She went up the steps, Harriet at her side, talking already about the room and the kitchen schedule and the territory's spring weather. The two women disappeared inside with the decisive energy of people who had recognized each other immediately as the same type. Nora stood at the foot of the steps and felt the specific quality of a total that had been tallied correctly, all the numbers in their proper columns, the sum accurate, nothing lost. Everett stood beside her. "Your mother," he said, "is formidable." "Yes," Nora said, "I learned it from her." They stood in the April light and listened to the sound of Harriet and Elspeth, already apparently in considerable agreement about something, the particular sound of two people who have found each other and are wasting no time. And Nora thought about the print shop and the train and the choosing hall and the 7 rejections that had led by routes she could not have predicted to this exact place. She thought about the ledger in her case still there, her father's handwriting in the columns, the precision she'd carried west as the one thing she knew for certain was worth carrying. She thought about the rebuilt accounts of Iron Gate Ranch, the clean quarterly reports, the federal record, with the survey boundaries protected and confirmed. She thought about what it meant to find a person who looked at you and chose to see accurately. 7 men had said no and had meant you are not enough. 1 man had said yes and had meant you are exactly right. And the difference between those two assessments was not the 7 and the 1. It was the quality of attention behind them, the willingness to look past what was performed and presented and conventionally valued and ask instead what was actually there. She had gone west with nothing by their measure. She had arrived with everything that mattered. That summer, Nora Elspeth Cross, she had signed the supply contract renewals with the new name for the first time in March without ceremony because it was accurate, posted 2 notices in Sage Flats. The first was for employment. Iron Gate Ranch was hiring. Positions in property management, livestock record keeping, and domestic operations. Fair wages, written contracts, no marriage required. Full terms negotiable. The second notice went to the town council and the committee that organized the annual social calendar, a formal proposal to abolish the choosing night that had been held in Sage Flats for 22 years. The proposal was, as she had expected, contested. The argument she made was not the one people expected. She did not argue that choosing night was degrading, though it was. She did not argue that it treated human beings as commodities, though it did. She argued instead from the records. She had the accounts from 3 years of Iron Gate supply fraud, and those accounts were caused in part by the incentive structure of choosing night. The pressure on women to demonstrate worth through conventional measures meant that women with unconventional skills were systematically excluded from work they were qualified for, and that exclusion was what had given Wade Cross 4 years of financial management without oversight. She set the numbers on the council table and said, "This is what it costs." It took 2 votes across 2 months. The first failed by 3 voices, the second passed by 2. Choosing night in its 23rd year was not held. Loretta Shaw was among the people who voted yes on the second ballot. She had, in the months since Wade's arrest, been making her own kind of revision to her ideas about worth a process Nora observed without comment and respected without taking credit for. Some adjustments people made themselves. You just needed to show them the numbers. The first woman Nora hired was a widow from Billings named June Alcott, who arrived with a 3-year-old in her arms and a set of practical skills she had been told were insufficient for most positions and were in fact more than sufficient for the records management role at Iron Gate. She was 28, and she had the look of someone who had been managing on insufficient resources for long enough that she had stopped believing relief was possible. She sat across from Nora in the office on her first morning and held her daughter on her lap with one arm and reviewed the account system with the other, asking the right questions. Nora watched her and felt something fold closed around itself cleanly. "You start Monday," she said. June Alcott looked up. Are you certain I should tell you I haven't had formal training, and I've never worked for a ranch before? And my daughter—" "Monday," Nora said. "Your daughter is welcome until you've arranged care. We have a spare room." She watched June Alcott's face do the specific thing that faces do when someone offers relief in a moment when relief had stopped being expected, not quite disbelief, not quite gratitude. The thing between those two that is both. She knew that look. She had worn it herself briefly at the foot of the stage steps in Sage Flats 9 months ago. "Thank you," June said. "Work well," Nora said. "That's the thanks I need." A year to the week after the choosing night that had changed her life, Nora stood on the Cutter's Ridge, the corridor that Margaret Cross had spent 6 months establishing in the federal record, that Wade Cross had spent 3 years trying to sell, that Nora had spent 5 months protecting, and that was now by every legal and actual measure secured, and looked east over the full reach of Iron Gate Ranch in the late September light. Everett was beside her. Her mother was behind them down at the house teaching Harriet a card game she claimed she'd learned from a riverboat passenger in 1864 and had never played wrong since. June Alcott's daughter was running along the fence line with the particular abandon of a child who has recently learned that space is infinite. The accounts were clean. The contracts were renewed. The survey boundaries were confirmed and the federal record protected and permanent. The ledger from her father's print shop was in the upper right drawer of her desk in the office, not filed away, just there, the handwriting visible. If you open the drawer, the ink-stained margins of a man who had believed in accuracy as a form of love for what was true. "What are you thinking about?" Everett asked. She thought about how to answer honestly. "About 7 men in a hall who listed what I lacked," she said, "and 1 man who asked what I was." He was quiet for a moment. "About my father," she said, "and how he would have found all of this exactly logical. That if you do accurate work accurately, the total comes out right eventually." "Does it always?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said, "not always. But if the numbers are right and the work is right, and you don't look away when the totals don't add up, then usually it comes out right." He looked at the view. She looked at him, looking at it. The amber eyes, the face that was its own kind of landscape. The quality of attention he brought to everything in his world that mattered, which was, she had learned, a larger category than he let on. "I'm glad I chose you," he said. "I'm glad I said yes," she said. Simple, accurate. The sum of the whole thing stated plainly, which was the only way it needed to be said. The September light lay across the Cutter's Ridge corridor, and the long east view of Iron Gate Ranch, and the accounts were clean, and everything that was supposed to be there Was there the work and the land and the people and the truth? All of it counted. All of it mattered. All of it at last properly finally added up.